Well, welcome everybody to our behavior team training with Dr. Rick Ben Acker. We're very happy to have him here. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Good morning. So I guess we'll start off. I always kind of like to start my sessions by reminding people about schools. Schools are kind of unique places, aren't they? Do we invite kids to come to school? No, what do? We compel them by law to come. And once they get there, what do? We make them work. We make them sit, for one thing. And some of you will realize how difficult sitting can be. Because usually in a classroom, who gets to move around? Yeah, the teachers, all the staff, we get to move around whenever we want to. The kids have to sit. They have to be quiet. They have to listen. They have to read, write. Okay? So we're compelling them to come. How many of you have heard it's my job to teach, it's your job to? These kids did not take a job. For many of these kids, if this was a job, they'd say, take this job and shove it, right? They don't want this job. So we're going to talk a lot today about behavior, and one of the challenges is that behavior triggers emotion in us. And so many times we react to the behavior that our students have, or that our students display, because we're not realizing that we chose to be here. As you look around this room, in most of your classrooms, you're the only volunteer. Everybody else is compelled to be there. You chose to be there. So as we talk about dealing with behavior, it oftentimes requires us to change our behavior first. In fact, I'd say about 95% of the time, you're not going to get a single change in students' behavior until you change what you're doing. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those kinds of issues. We're going to talk today about kids who are at risk and who display mental health issues. This is becoming a kind of a growing concern. Now, in the past, most of us in education, first let's see, how many are teachers? Okay. Psychologists? Anybody? Social workers? Okay. Other? What are you if you're another? Okay. What are you? Okay, therapist, okay. All right, so we're going to talk about mental health issues. Now, think about your school. Have you seen more of an increase in issues around mental health? Okay. How many of you, as part of your pre-service training, feel that you got a good knowledge base on children's mental health issues? Okay. Most of the time, I'm from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm in the Department of Special Education. I actually teach that survey course that everybody that touches schools has to take, where we go through each of the disabilities, right? And I know that in most of these classrooms, we'll talk about things like, there's this thing called the DSM-5, and that's the American Psychological Association. They have a whole bunch of categories, and we don't care about those because they don't affect education. We talk about IDEA. And the number of disabilities that they recognize, those are educational disabilities, those are the disabilities we are concerned with and that we teach our teachers with, as though the kids are going to leave their DSM-5 diagnoses and mental health issues at the door when they come in. All right? So we're seeing a huge increase in the number of issues. How many of you work with preschoolers, kindergartners, or first graders? How many of you have seen a significant increase in the number of problems that we're seeing in that population? Okay. I'm getting more calls as a behavior, working with schools around their behavior with kids in those grade levels than I am in older kids, which is quite a significant shift. Now, part of that is because we're seeing some differences in terms of who's coming to school. We're also, people say, well, kids have changed. And it's not that children have changed, childhood has changed. What we expect of kids, what kids have experienced has changed dramatically. Kids are still kids. Okay, they're bringing the same developmental issues and needs and all those kinds of things into place. We sometimes aren't necessarily open to recognize those. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those issues. Before we get started, obviously, I've generally come into this group and talked about behavior intervention plans and FBAs and trying to identify the functions of behavior. And we're going to talk about how mental health fits into that model and into talking about that. But let me start off by seeing if there are any overriding questions, things that you said, gee, I took the day because I hope this guy talks about this. Any big key issues that you were hoping we'd talk about today? Anybody? You just wanted a day off and some free salad? Okay. All right. As things come up, if you have questions, concerns, raise your hand. We'll pass the mic around so people can, so it's going to be on the tape, or I'll repeat your questions that you ask, and we'll go from there. All right. One of the things that has come to light in recent years was a study. Most of you probably are familiar with this, the ACEs study, which basically looks at adverse conditions that are affecting children. And what this was a study where they looked at basically 17,000 college students, and they asked them to fill out a survey in terms of, did you experience certain kinds of issues in your childhood? And then they were looking at mental health, physical health, all those kinds of outcomes, and were absolutely shocked at what they found. And so this is kind of a summary. So what you see is, and it doesn't show up as well as I should have maybe made that dark. Do I have an incarcerated household member? If one of my parents is incarcerated, that's a risk factor. And about 7% of the people responding to this survey said, yes, one of my parents was incarcerated, or a family member was incarcerated. This thing is going to keep popping up, and I apologize. I don't know how to quite cut that out, but we'll keep popping it down. Was I the victim of sexual abuse? Was I sexually abused? 10%. Drug use was a problem in my family. Okay, 10%. Witnessed domestic violence, 14%. Physical abuse, 16%. Mental illness in the household, 17%. Separated or divorced parent, 21%. Drinking problem in the household, 24%. Verbal abuse, 28%. If you had 3 or more of these, you are at significant risk for having significant mental health and emotional regulation problems. Take a minute, talk to your partner. Think about the kids you're working with. How many of the kids that you're most challenged with have 3 or 4 of these or more risk factors? And just chat a little bit amongst yourselves. How big of a problem is this for you? Yeah, it's incarcerated household members, sexual abuse, drug use problem in the household, witnessed domestic violence, physical abuse, mental illness in the household, separated or divorced parent, drinking problems, or verbal abuse. So how many of you have kids that have at least 3 or 4 of these? Okay, yeah, it's pretty common kind of a situation. And I think that one of the issues that happens is that when you see these children coming into the classroom, many of these kids begin to display behaviors that look very ADHD-like. Their ability to concentrate, their ability to stay seated and to comply and to follow expectations. And so we start seeing an awful lot of these children being identified, or at least parents are being said, I think your kid has ADHD. Maybe you should have this child evaluated. They need a little shot of Ritalin, right? That'll make things better. Okay? And how many of you have had students with ADHD who have not responded to medication? Okay? It's about 1/3 of children that go to the doctor that get a diagnosis of ADHD. The medication does not make any impact whatsoever. It very well may be these children do not have ADHD. These are simply kids who have confronted with enough adverse situations that they are displaying the symptoms of ADHD, but really don't have the disorder. So they're not going to respond to the medication designed for it. Now, another 1/3 of these kids are going to basically respond for a while, then the body seems to typically gets used to that medication, it no longer is effective, and you start playing medication roulette. So what happens is that if I've got this kind of biological substrate for some of these issues, you experience some of these adverse conditions, and it really starts to change brain structure, the cognitions, the way I address problems, my experience, I get social impairments. Anxiety, depression, all these things start to build, and you start getting layers, social withdrawal, and then you start showing some of the symptoms of the mental health issues, and ultimately some significant mental health kinds of situations. So this kind of grows. So the earlier we recognize that a student is at risk for some of these issues and actually address it, the better off we're going to be. Now, one of the challenges we'll see as we go through today is that individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, individuals with people with visual impairments, are at a significant risk factor for not being identified as having problems, because we say, oh, well, that's just part of the issue of them having a hearing impairment or a visual impairment. And we don't have really strong assessment procedures for these populations to identify some of these. So many of your clients, many of your students are going to go underdiagnosed and therefore underserved. So one of the issues that we have, students who are with hearing impairments have a higher rate of neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all risk factors for that adverse conditions kind of a situation, 25% higher than their hearing peers. And gender-wise, significant differences. So 10% of hearing boys, 25% of hearing girls, sexual abuse, versus 54% of boys and 50% of girls who are deaf and hard of hearing. Huge difference there, especially for the boys. Okay. So there doesn't seem to be any direct correlation. Maltreatment, higher rates of negative cognition, depression, post-traumatic stress. Well, there is a direct correlation, I'm sorry. Right? So part of the thing that goes on here is I have these, I've got this young child, and part of the issue is that these kids are oftentimes taught to be more compliant. Right? They don't have the language skills, they don't have the ability necessarily to understand what's being asked of them. They want to be responsive, they want to be liked and accepted, and so they're more likely to fall victim. Right? They have the reduced communication skills to be able to say no, to be able to communicate that they've been abused, and so they're easier to prey on. They're less likely to say that they'd be able to communicate that there was a sexual abuse situation that took place or what's going on. And overall, a general lack of awareness that they are at an additional risk factor. And so the adults that are working with them oftentimes don't know to even begin to work with them around some of these kinds of issues to make them less susceptible to being preyed upon. Okay. Are you finding that as true in the groups that you're working with? Yes? Okay. Right. Visual impairment. Same kinds of issues kind of come into place. There's a strong comorbid situation in terms of visual impairments and mental health kinds of issues. Right? Many of those influenced by the fact that I've got the visual impairments. So whether it's if I have this loss of sight, so I was sighted and all of a sudden I'm losing my sight. So for example, I work with Wisconsin School for the Blind in Janesville, and many of the students that get sent in there are in the fact of losing their sight in the process, and so people are working with them to try to get them to some mobility skills, all these kinds of issues before they've lost all their sight. The dilemma is that many of these young people are going through some so significant of emotional trauma related to the loss of their sight that it makes learning very, very difficult. Okay? And unfortunately, again, most schools don't want to deal with mental health. Schools are fearful. They're kind of going, oh, this is going to be another unfunded mandate. We're not taking on mental health. Right? Again, as though the mental health isn't coming in, right? Again, the symptoms, dependent upon the degree of my visual loss, those kinds of things, how much anxiety I'm going to have, how much depression I'm going to have, varies by virtue of the individual. But again, it becomes difficult to assess what's going on with the people that are going on. Okay. Girls with visual impairments experience more symptoms of depression and anxiety than do boys, but that's true across the board. That's typical with sighted individuals also. Okay? And longitudinal studies that emotional problems in these young children may become less as they age. So that's a good thing. Okay. So think about a typical classroom. If your students are in just a general education classroom, typical situation is going on, 1 in 5 children are currently thought to have a diagnosable mental health problem. 1 in 5. So if I've got 25 kids in my class, 5 of them have a diagnosable mental health problem. Okay? A couple of studies, 27% of children 9, 11, and 13 years of age, diagnosable mental health. An additional 16% had some significant issues, but not enough to necessarily classify them as having a diagnosable problem. So I'm still showing some significant issues, but just not enough to necessarily meet those DSM-5 categories, okay? 21% of children live with mental health problems receive mental health services. So the vast majority are getting no services. And those that are getting services, guess who's giving it to them? We are. We are this nation's children's mental health program. Schools provide over 70% of the mental health services that if a kid gets anything at all, it's coming from the school, or it's being delivered at the school. Okay? It may be because you've got a cooperative agreement with a mental health facility, but if it's not happening at the school, it's probably not happening. Okay? So whether we want to be or not, we are this nation's children's mental health program. And 13% of children live with at least one parent who has a mental health concern. Now, you want to have some real significant issues? Live with a mom or a dad with bipolar disorder unmedicated. Every day is a new experience in terms of what the hell is going to be asked of me today. Okay? And apples come from apple trees, right? So many of these children that we're seeing with mental health issues are going homes where there are mental health issues, and that further complicates factors. Probably everybody in this room at one time or another said there ought to be one more special ed category called crazy-ass parent. Right? Okay? Where we've had this situation, it's kind of like if we could get him a new family, everything would be fine, right? We just need to get a different family. Right? And again, many of these families, the parents are struggling with their own mental health issues. And on top of that, then many of them are beginning to self-medicate, and you start getting into substance abuse and those kinds of issues, and it can be a real nightmare, okay? Another study, 13% of children and adolescents have an anxiety disorder. This is the #1 growth area for mental health. Now, why might we be seeing more anxiety disorders in schools? Yes, we have created the perfect storm. If I ever wanted to set up an environment where if I've got any biological predisposition, genetic predisposition for anxiety disorders, put me in a school that's saying, we're going to test you every time you turn around. We are going to push the curriculum down further and further to where we are now asking preschoolers, kindergartners, first graders to do work that isn't even developmentally appropriate. Okay? If you do not leave kindergarten now reading, you are in serious trouble. Okay? And yet there are, the differentiation in terms of development at that 4, 5, 6-year-old is pretty tremendous. That not all of these kids are ready. And I don't have the self-regulation skills, so when you start pushing me to do something, I'm up and out. I am not going to sit here and deal with this. And all of a sudden we've got these preschool teachers going, what the hell is happening? I've never seen this before, right? And it's like they're running all over the school. And the principals are going, what's with our preschool teacher, right? So we're seeing some issues. 6.2% mood disorders. These are tough ones in terms of that they oftentimes tend to act in. This is where you get people who are cutting, people who are depressed, those kinds of situations, and may not get picked up whatsoever. So we were doing a study in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. It was basically, this was years ago, it was a number of the board members wanted to know about this whole inclusion thing. Was this inclusion stuff really helpful? Because they're putting these troubled kids into my daughter's classroom, and it's taking time away from my daughter, right? So we got to make sure this inclusion stuff works. So they wanted us to come up and do some work to see what happens with inclusion. So one of the things we wanted to find out was when kids were in included classrooms, did they actually become part of the social network? So we were asking some questions, first of all, to find out what the social networks were. So we were asking kids to name all, you have basically a sheet with a bunch of little lines, and you'd say, okay, name as many girl friendship groups in this classroom as you can think of. Name as many boy different friendship groups. They can be boy and girl, whatever the situation is. Now, what's interesting, girls can name lots of groups, right? They will name their group, and then they will say, Mary and Bill and Jen are friends, and Livia's a friend with that, and Alicia thinks she is, but she really isn't, right? And they've got it all laid out, kind of a thing, right? And they can name, and then they flip the sheet over, and they've got ones in the back. They can name the boy groups. Boys can name their group and the most popular girl group, and then they're done. All right? That's all I need to know, okay, kind of a situation. So we found out who the social networks were. Then we wanted to find out, what about these social networks? Who were these kids? So we used a measure that basically allows kids to nominate up to 3 people that fit a category. So it might say, who's cool? And then it would have a sentence, this person's really fun to be with, everybody wants to be this person's friend. And they could name nobody, 1 person, 2 people, or 3 people, including themselves. And we had different, who's athletic, who's a good student, and we had one that said, who is sad? And we had a little girl in 3rd grade the class had 26 students. 23 of her students, including herself, identified her as sad. We also asked the teachers to nominate, and the teacher didn't pick up on that at all. So when you get that many people nominating, you get some pretty reliable information in terms of what's going on. So again, those mood disorders, those acting in disorders are oftentimes very, very likely to be missed by staff. Okay? 2% or 10.3% have disruptive disorders. Those aren't hard to find. They don't get overlooked. Okay? Unfortunately, the problem is that many of our interventions actually exacerbate the problem as opposed to helping the problem. All right? And so we'll talk about that. And this is where some of the mental health issues come into play, that if I've got some mental health issues, people unfortunately like to look at acting out behavior as willful, chosen behavior. You're choosing to do this, and we are going to punish you out of it. And the dilemma is that if my behavior is got a substrate of mental health issues, you are not going to punish me out of my mental health issues. You are only going to make them worse. Okay? And we'll talk about some of those disorders and how they trigger us. 2% have substance abuse disorders. Oftentimes that is the beginning of self-medication. Right? And a total of 20.9% having 1 or more mental health disorders. The other challenge that we have is that very few kids have 1 mental health disorder. They have comorbid mental health disorders. And in many cases, these don't play nice together. So for example, many of you may have a child who has ADHD and also has some sort of anxiety or mood disorder. And unfortunately, the medication for the mood disorder will aggravate my ADHD. And the medication for my ADHD will aggravate my mood disorder. And so you generally have to decide, which devil do I want to dance with? Because you can't medicate them both. All right? Or you're just kind of canceling everything out, and you're just kind of pouring chemicals down somebody. All right, now the dilemma comes into children with visual and hearing impairments twice as likely to have a mental health issue. So now instead of 5, I've got 10. Okay? And again, generally unrecognized. Okay? The median age for beginning to show serious symptoms is 11 years old. Over half the people who will ever have a mental health disorder in their lifetime will begin to show symptoms before the age of 14. But they will not have a diagnosis. They will just start showing behaviors. Okay? And then part of the dilemma comes out is that we're, as special educators, different people working with the children, now they have a behavior that's interfering with their learning or the learning of others. So what does that mean? Come on, you guys have been sitting through my sessions before. If you've got a behavior that interferes with your learning, the learning of others, you have to do what? You have to develop a behavior intervention plan. And that behavior intervention plan has to be informed by a FBA, a functional assessment of behavior. And the assumption is that all behavior, or at least most behavior, serves a function, it's learned. The dilemma comes into the mental health piece. Is it necessarily learned? Now that doesn't mean that it's not impacted by the environment and factors that go on in the environment, but there is the issue that the mental health issue itself becomes like a setting event to the nature of the problem and can very much influence not only the display of the behavior, but any intervention efforts that you're going to make. If I don't have the appreciation that there's a mental health piece to this, I'm likely to miss that. And I'm likely to employ interventions that, while effective for kids without mental health issues, generally will not be terribly effective for kids with mental health issues. So this becomes one of those key things to say, I've got to at least consider this. And again, with the populations you're working with, the risk factors are so much greater, it becomes something to be much more knowledge about in terms of if I'm a social worker, even when I'm doing the family histories, is this a family that has some mental health issues in the family? That this suggests that there is this kind of genetic basis that maybe we need to look a little bit more seriously at some of these kinds of issues. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about some of these. These are some of the common children's mental health disorders. Autism spectrum disorder. Okay. And again, for those of you, I'm sure you all know this has been a change with the DSM-5. We used to have different categories, and they've scrapped that now and said, nope, we're just lumping them all together. It's autism spectrum disorder, because some of those categories were pretty arbitrary to begin with in terms of how we divided people out in terms of what's going on. We'll talk a little bit about this. Individuals with hearing impairments have a greater likelihood of having comorbid autism. So there's a higher comorbidity between those issues. In the DSM-5, there was a group of kids that were going, these kids aren't really quite, don't meet the criteria for autism, but they've got some really strange issues that are impacting their functioning. And so we're going to create a new category. And so we've got the social communication disorder, which is kind of autism light. Okay? It's some of the features, but not enough to categorize them, but enough to clearly impact and interfere with their learning. So they've created a new category. We're struggling with that category to see, does it have, is it really reliable and valid and meaningful? And does it tell us anything about treatment? If I've got that label, does that tell me anything? And so it's new, and so we're playing with it. The externalizing attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, okay? Anybody here not have somebody with ADHD in their group? Okay, this is kind of the order of the day. Everybody has ADHD. And you've probably got school psychologists or community psychologists that I don't care who you would take, you would get an ADHD diagnosis. You could take your family cat, it would come out with a report. He has ADHD, okay? And in fact, the report is probably the very same report they wrote for the last kid, only the names have changed. And in some cases, not even all the names, right? As you read the report, you're going, who's Sally? Where did Sally come from, okay? Oppositional defiant disorder, that's not new, we'll talk about that. That's the one you all just love when you see that on an IEP coming to you, right? Little Billy has oppositional defiant disorder, and you're going, shit, right? Maybe he goes in the other class, right? This shouldn't be in our class, all right? Conduct disorder. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Anybody have anybody like that labeled in your class, in your groups, that you're aware of? This was a situation, one of the problems we also have with mental health disorders in the DSM-5 is that children display many of these disorders very differently than adults do. And so, for example, depression looks different in kids than it does in adults, these kinds of things. And so what it used to be was the fact that you would have age limits. So not too many years ago, you could not be depressed until you were 17. Okay? At 16 and a half, you're just a little blue, all right? But at 17, now you can be officially depressed, all right? So what we've found is that the age groups are coming down because they're beginning to be much more cognizant of that, yeah, there are depressed children, there are depressed very young children. It just looks different. And so therefore, how I categorize it, how I assess it, how I define it is a little bit different for younger kids in terms of what's going on. This particular disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, came into play because we were beginning to push the identification of kids with bipolar disorder down lower and lower and lower, and people were uncomfortable with that. They were saying, wow, that is a pretty heavy-duty diagnosis for somebody who's 7. Let's think about this. And so they came up with this. They said, okay, it's characterized by severe and recurrent temper outbursts that are grossly out of proportion to the situation or in intensity or duration, and they occur on an average of 3 or more times a week for a year or more. Now, these are very, very tough kids. All right? And we are seeing many kids coming into our preschools, kindergartens, first grades, second grades, who are displaying these kinds of outbursts on a frequent basis. Now, we're not sure what's going on here. Is this mental health? Is this just the fact this kid is under-socialized? Are we simply trying to place this child in a situation that's demanding too much from them in terms of what's coming on? in the situation. But what we're finding is they are tearing up our classrooms. They are tearing up our schools. And I mean, I'm working with a little guy over in northeast or northwest Indiana. I mean, he literally was jumping from desk to desk in the classroom. He bit the principal. He was, I mean, he was tearing things up. We can't educate this kid. So they were thinking, okay, well, we're going to put him on homebound. He was going to get education for 1 hour a week. And it's like, no, that's not going to help the situation. We've got to work with this young man. But what we found is that we've really had to, in some cases, we kicked the speech teacher out of their office. This became this student's classroom. We had stuff we could move in. If things got bad, we just simply pulled it out, gave him a chance to calm down, brought it back in, worked very intensively with him. Now, in 6 weeks of intensive work, we got it to where we could now take him back into the first grade classroom, work with him in terms of what's going on. We actually took him into a first grade class. He was younger, but we thought these kids would be a little bit bigger and not as likely to get hurt, this kind of thing. And got it to where things were going on, but that was pretty intensive work, and public schools aren't necessarily prepared for that. But we're seeing far more kids coming going, what are we going to do with these kids? How are we going to serve these students in our schools? Now, we'll talk about this disorder and what's happening. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder in girls, basically tied to their menstrual period, and it's very severe mood kind of issues going on. Internalizing, these kind of have stayed the same in terms of anxiety disorders, depression, but we're seeing an increase. Again, anxiety is the #1 growth disorder, mental health disorder that we're seeing. Right? We're seeing more depression. Post-traumatic stress disorder, I think it's interesting. They now have a new subtype for kids under the age of 6. Okay. So we had so many young children, we had to create a new subtype. Right? Now, schools are kind of the last place, but we're starting to see more going on in schools where they're talking about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed instruction, some of those kinds of things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Other disorders, LD, specific learning disabilities, intellectual, eating disorders, substance abuse, self-harming, tic disorders. Things like Tourette's syndrome, tic disorders are not unusual comorbid disorders. And one of the challenges that oftentimes happens with those disorders is that the student will start to display tics, and then they become anxious because of the tics. And the anxiety triggers more tics, and it becomes, again, this downward spiral. And then oftentimes the student will act out as a way to get out of a situation where they're feeling like they're looking pretty strange. And so you just start getting these things piling on top of each other. Early onset major mental illness, schizophrenia, and bipolar. Okay, now, these are the mental health disorders that that the research has shown there is no difference in the visually impaired, hearing impaired, and the normal, typical functioning kind of hearing and sighted peers. They've looked at that and said, we aren't seeing any differences in number, we aren't seeing any differences in terms that are going on. These are the ones that they're saying we are seeing some significant differences. Much, much greater risk. Okay? So autism, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, LD, and intellectual disabilities. All right. Oh, the degree of hearing impairment or loss is not correlated with the range of mental health problems. So that's an interesting finding. All right. We've shown this before, and some of these slides, if you people have been in this class with me before, you'll see, hey, we've seen this slide before. And just because it's still critical, all right? When these things, and this is always changing, when these different disorders pop up, tend to be tied to various age groups. So as you're going along, you're more likely to start seeing these symptoms. You're still more likely to start seeing these symptoms, this kind of situation. The one that, at least for me, is really, really critical is this group of disorders right here. Because we play a major role in increasing the risk for a comorbid disorder to take place. So if you've got little Billy, or we'll say for me, little Ricky, is in your classroom and I'm non-compliant, I'm up, I'm moving around, I'm not following directions, what am I going to hear a lot of? Sit down, stop it, all right? In fact, my name might start meaning stop it. Ricky, Ricky, all right? And I am likely to go home with far more reprimands than praise. So basically what we're kind of saying is whatever you do at school, you don't do it well. Hey, but come back tomorrow enthusiastic, won't you? So tomorrow I can tell you again that whatever we do at school, you don't do it well. And so by the time this kid gets to second or third grade, it's kind of like, I don't like you or the horse you rode in on. I've already dropped out of school. I'm just waiting for my body to get old enough that I can leave. All right? They don't like school. They don't want anything to do with it. And if I start punishing people for compliance problems, especially if it's tied to attention deficit disorder, are you going to punish me out of my ADHD? No. So all of a sudden, I talk out. Now, again, we've asked this question before. If I go into most classrooms and say, if I'm looking to say, what do teachers reprimand? What is the most common behavior teachers reprimand? Talking out, okay? Which in some of your populations, that's going to be a whole different issue, right? Talking out is the number one thing kids get reprimanded for. All right? Now, I'm little Ricky, I've got ADHD. Am I likely to become more disruptive? Engage in some of these behaviors? Now, if I watch a typical teacher, are they consistent about how they handle talk-outs? No, you talk out and I go, yes, that's right. And I actually praise the talk out. And she talks out and I ignore it. And you talk out and I go, what is rule 3? Right? And I'll sit in classrooms sometimes and I'll go, damn, I do this for a living. I can't figure out what the hell the expectation is in this classroom. Because some kids talk out and it's fine. Other kids talk out and they get in trouble. And I'm little Ricky with ADHD. How many times do I talk out? Or make vocalizations or do the... A lot, right? 62 in this last hour. All right? Now, do I recognize that I do this more frequently? No. So I talk out and the teacher goes, you need to raise your hand and wait to be called upon. And she talks out and gets praised. What the hell is this all about? This doesn't feel very fair to me. This is not a good place. I'm getting punished for what other kids are getting praised for. And what we find is that if I start feeling like I'm being punished for behaviors I can't control or I don't understand, it tends to lead to the development, if I've got any predisposition, to oppositional defiant behavior. It is one of the most common comorbid disorders with ADHD. So if I am being punished for these behaviors, for movement, for all these kinds of situations, and again, many times individuals with hearing impairments, if I start signing fast, people see this as you're getting out of control. That's no, this is just, I want you to know what's going on. And so there's even a greater risk of misinterpretation in some of our individuals with hearing and visual impairments. And if I want to push this, I can actually move into a conduct disorder. So these tend to play together as building comorbid disorders, and it's tied very much to if I am experiencing an environment that is utilizing punishment, especially punitive responses, to the symptoms of my disorders. And that's school. As much as we talk about positive behavioral interventions and supports, we still like punishment. Okay? All right. Within the school, when it comes to behaviors, emotional kinds of issues that are going on, we basically have two categories we generally lump kids into. Other health impaired or emotional disability. Okay? Now, the problem is that emotional disability is not a favorable category. The federal government, when they first set this up in 1974, thought that there should be around 2% of the population should fall into emotional disability. And at that point it was called significant emotional disturbance. Right? Significant? Yeah. Now it's just emotional. Okay, but they thought 2%. All right. Most experts in the field say it's probably somewhere between 5 and 7%, 5 and 9%. Some individuals say it's 20%. Okay. In some of our large schools, as more than half the students will be displaying some significant kinds of behavior problems. Right? In the United States, in the area of emotional disability, since 1975, when we first started identifying these kids, we only had 1 year in which there was more than 1% of the population identified with an emotional disability. It's the most underdiagnosed disability in our categories of disabilities. Right? Part of it's because it's just not popular, so we'll throw them under a different label in some cases. All right? Well, he's kind of got a learning problem too. Let's make him LD. All right? Well, that'll work. Okay. But we're missing oftentimes the the categorization and in some cases the safety net that category actually provides for students and the services that sometimes that opened the door for in terms of what's going on. Okay? So again, 20% of the youth are diagnosed with disorder, 9 to 13% some substantial functional impairment, 5 to 9 extreme functional impairment, and basically 0.8 to 1% gets identified every year. Okay. If I have a problem of any kind of emotional situation in the school, the most likely thing I'm going to get sent in for is ADHD. All right, that's going to be the first one. I think part of it's because as teachers we're comfortable with ADHD. We know it. Usually those kinds of behaviors are the ones that trigger us because these kids are up moving around, they're not paying attention, they're not complying, they're not organized, all those different kind of things that are going on. And so they go in for a diagnosis of ADHD. And again, we've talked about before that there are situations going on to the fact that if I've got ADHD, what kind of characteristics am I likely to show you? What are you going to see from me? Impulsivity. All right, so if it comes in my head, it goes out my mouth, right? I don't have that internal voice saying, maybe you shouldn't say shit, right? Maybe this is not a good thing, all right? I don't think the teacher will like this, okay? What else might you see? Yeah, lots of movement, fidgeting, all right? That kind of Einstein from here up, Fred Astaire from here down, right? Organizational skills. The kid might say, science? Gee, that's that orange book. I wonder where that's at, right? And they start digging for those kinds of things. So all those things, are those irritating to teachers? Do they interfere with the child's learning? So do we have to do an FBA and a BIP for it? Yes, all right? Does the fact that I have ADHD play a role in the fact that I don't have impulse control? Right. So where does that come into the BIP? Where does that come into the FBA? How are we dealing with some of those kinds of situations? Okay. Criteria for this one, just so people know, symptoms must be present for 6 months to a degree that's maladaptive and inconsistent with the developmental level of the child. Okay. It's got to have a clearly significant impairment in 2 or more settings. So it can't be just at school. Is it school home, school community? Where am I seeing 2 settings in where these things are significantly impairing or impacting my functioning? And the onset has to be before the age of 12. Okay? It used to be 7. This is one of the changes in DSM-5. Now it's up till 12. Okay? All right, and it can be diagnosed later. So just because I'm older doesn't mean I can't get a diagnosis of ADHD, but I have to go back and find data that supports the idea that I was showing these symptoms prior to age 12. Okay, so you can get diagnosed as an adult, but they're going to have to find the symptoms earlier. All right. So here, got to display 6 of these 9. And if you read through these, most of us go, damn, I do that one, and I do that one, okay? And again, the issue is not that you do it, but do you do it to the point that it's significantly different than other people around you kind of a situation, and it impacts your functioning. Frequent careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention in task or play, fails to listen when spoken to directly, fails to follow through on tasks or follow directions, difficulty organizing tasks or activities, avoids tasks that require sustained attention, often loses things, is easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, and forgetful in daily activities. Now, some people will say, well, he does that at school and in schoolwork, but you know what? If I get the iPad out and hand that to that sucker, he can hang into these games like there is no tomorrow. He has no problem whatsoever sustaining his attention to that game. Now, part of the issue, the problem that we have is that gaming, especially those video games, are the absolute perfect environment for the ADHD mind. Okay? It scans the keyboard 100 times a minute, so it's going to give them instantaneous feedback. Right? In most cases, games are set up that if I make too many errors, the game will automatically lower the difficulty level to keep me at a high enough level of success that I'll keep playing the game. And only at the higher levels does that shut off. So then it starts going for, okay, this person's got enough skill, now competition is critical. Below, error level is critical. Okay? So most games will never allow the child to ever have less than an 80% level of correct responding and immediate feedback. If we could do that in our schools, we would see a huge drop in the number of people that are having problems. Okay? but we don't. Okay, so they can sustain that because it's the perfect environment for it. Okay? If I meet 6 of these 9, I have ADHD in attentive type. Okay. Hyperactive, often fidgets with hands or feet, squirms in seat. Leaves seat when required to sit, runs about or climbs excessively. Often has difficulty playing or engaging in leisure activities quietly. Is often on the go or acts as if driven by a motor. I love that one. Talks excessively, blurts out answers before questions are completed. Difficulty waiting his or her turn. Often interrupts or intrudes on others. Now, again, it's that impulse control. Weighing out some of these issues, sometimes these kids that blurt out answers before the questions answer the thing and do a lot of the talk outs, sometimes I may have a student who's got a significant learning disability, and all of a sudden there's a question that I know the answer. I am not going to wait to holler out that answer because I want to show everybody in the class that I am not stupid, right? And there's not too many of these puppies that come along that I can answer, but this one I can, all right? So I'm going to jump on it while the train goes by, all right? So I don't lose the opportunity. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I have ADHD and those kinds of things. So when you're doing your functional assessments, looking at what's going on here, how's this happening, if I'm only doing this in certain subject areas because I happen to know the answers, probably not ADHD. Okay? If I have 6 of these 9, I am ADHD hyperactive type. Okay? If I have 6 of both, I am ADHD combined type. And that is the most common. Most kids that have ADHD combined type. So you're going to see both of these issues. Now, when you are doing an FBA and a BIP, in many cases, looking at these different categories can be helpful in terms of writing your goals, because where are these showing up? Which of these particular issues seem to be problematic that you're trying to help this student develop some self-regulation skills for? So looking at the diagnostic criteria sometimes can be very helpful in our goal writing, to be clear about what we're looking at. That make sense? All right. So ADHD primary inattentive type, 6 months, six or more inattentive symptoms. 6 months of hyperactive impulsive, then I'm hyperactive impulsive type, and then I've got the combined type. All right. 3 to 12% of school-age children and adolescents, 4 to 9 times more likely in boys. Now, what's interesting is that that's not true in Germany. Now, one of the differences in Germany is that most elementary teachers in Germany are males. And so there may be a gender culture thing playing out here in that since most of our elementary teachers are females, we're not nearly as tolerant with little boys' behaviors as male teachers might be. And so some of this there may be a cultural overlay, but I find that as an interesting cultural differentiation. Because there's no reason why that all of a sudden there's this German substrate that has less genetic predisposition for ADHD. All right? 30 to 50% of individuals with ADHD display a comorbid disorder. Okay? So if you've got a little guy in your classroom that's got ADHD, there's a better than, right around 50% chance he's got something else going on too. Okay? This is that adversity thing that we talked about before, that toxic stress. If I'm experiencing that toxic stress of being in those adverse conditions, I am going to start looking very ADHD-like. I'm going to show many of those very same symptoms. So I may go through and the child will actually qualify as we're following through this because he's showing these kinds of things. And this is an area that's under a lot of research right now in terms of trying to help us figure out, is there a better way for us to differentiate that adverse conditions kind of a situation? Because that's going to take a different kind of intervention. Medication, all right. Ritalin, the stimulants are still the medication of choice as a first go-around. Now, why would I give a kid who's bouncing off the wall a stimulant? It makes sense at all, does it? Actually, what it does is there's certain parts of the brain, frontal lobes, that deal with risk, the hippocampus that deals with issues around attention, those kinds of things, don't function nearly as effectively in children with ADHD. A low dosage of a stimulant medication excites those parts of the brain and allows me to have better attention. Okay? But what I want is a very, very low dosage to increase my attention. I do not want enough medication to impact my motor behavior. Who talks to the doctor when they're talking about medication dosages? The parent. Are parents in a good place to say, I think Billy's attending better? Generally, parents want to see a change in motor behavior. Can I take him to grandma's house and not have him take the VCR apart? Okay? That's how much medication I want. Okay? And they are over-medicating their children. So oftentimes you will get parents who go, oh, we went that medication, or that was terrible. He wasn't sleeping, or he'd never wake up, or he gained 40 pounds. And we get all those side effects, and usually it's because they were over-medicating. You really want a very, very low dosage. So if you have a student who has ADHD and they're looking at medication, try to get the school tied in with the pediatrician or the psychiatrist, psychologist, in terms of that you are giving feedback on attending. There usually is a little 3-point kind of a Likert scale kind of a thing that doctors will give you to say, as they're playing with the medication, to get the dosage correct. Play into that, because what you really want is, okay, she's attending better. Now we can put programming in place. If I give her enough medication to really impact her motor behavior, she's less likely to attend than she was before medication at all. I'm probably worse off than if I didn't have any medication. Although my day will go better and I might be all right with that. About a third of children respond effectively to medication, and it's the best thing since sliced bread. If you've got a student with ADHD and they are responding, they are going to be so much more open to learning, they're going to be so much more successful, that parents should not be afraid of medication in terms of low dosages if it works. The problem is, for about 2/3 of kids, it doesn't work. Now, again, 1/3 of those might be the kids that aren't even ADHD. Another third just seem to be resistant to medications. Their bodies seem to get very tolerant, and all of a sudden the medication doesn't work really well again. And then you start playing medication roulette, and that's a bit of a challenge. Okay. Okay. Comorbid disorder is oppositional defiant disorder 34% of the time. Okay. If I've got ADHD and I've got a comorbid disorder, the most common one is going to be oppositional defiant disorder. And again, we already talked about how those build together. All right. Another 28 will display comorbid anxiety disorders, and a large national study, 51% of adults with ADHD suffered from comorbid anxiety disorders and 32% suffered from depression. So again, some people will talk about ADHD, I grow out of it. You don't grow out of ADHD. What happens is that you begin to have more control over your life, and you don't put yourselves in situations where your particular problems are going to keep beating you in the head. You tend to find ways to where those issues don't become so problematic, and you're much more successful. You've still got ADHD, right? You're just you just got more control about what's going on. School is not a good place for someone with ADHD. Right? It's equally not good for a person who has oppositional defiant disorder. If I've got both, school is hell. Okay? All right. Pattern of negativistic, hostile, and defiant behavior lasting greater than 6 months, of which you have 4 or more of the following. Extreme loss of temper, argues with adults, actively defies or refuses to comply with rules, often deliberately annoys people, blames others for his or her mistakes, touchy, easily annoyed with others, angry and resentful, spiteful and vindictive. I want 3 of them, right? I love these kids in my classroom, okay? This is a challenge, all right? And these kids trigger emotion in us, all right? Because they are going to fly right in your face, okay? And what do most teachers do when I get a student who becomes very disruptive and defiant? I get more controlling. Und you will do it, and you will like it, yeah? We have ways of making you, all right? And all of a sudden I get this kind of Gestapo thing going. And I think somehow I'm going to make this student crack, right? They're going to see who's boss. No, they're not. These kids could care less. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. In fact, all you're doing is throwing gas on a fire. And the odds are they're going to say, see, I am absolutely right. This is a hostile place, and I'm right to be angry. All right? So it becomes a real challenge for us. All right? This is not just willful behavior. So how many of you have been in this class with me before? a few times. Okay. Do you remember when I do that thing about that school being an unusual place? I asked somebody to sing. Remember the first time we did that? Does anybody remember that? I usually do that. I didn't pick on you guys. Usually I look for somebody who looks like they're kind of shy and will blush really good. And I'll say, I'd like you to stand up and sing a song for us. And the person, right, kind of thing. They go into fight or flight. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But when I go into fight or flight, my body goes through lots of chemical changes. Different hormones are released, different kind of situations. Enzymes are going differently. My body, the breathing, everything starts to change. For kids with oppositional defiant disorder, in addition to all the typical things that happen that we'll talk about under anxiety, the dopamine, serotonin levels completely flood the other way. And so all of a sudden, issues of risk, of lack of fear are flooded, and it's biological. It is not just I'm going to do this because I'm going to do it. I am biologically at this point in time with my fight or flight. This is what I have to do to be safe. And so they are going to go into it. Now, in some cases, safety becomes a key issue for kids with oppositional defiant disorder. And this sounds really stupid. Okay, but if all of a sudden the environment gets threatening for me, okay, and I go, you know what? This is bullshit. I am not doing this. This fucking class sucks. Can I pretty much count on what the teacher's going to do? Okay? I can pretty much, I know exactly what buttons I have to push with what teachers to get them to go, right? And my being able to predict how you're going to respond makes my world safer, right? It ain't going to be good, but it's predictable. And predictable is better than unpredictable. And so in many cases, this is their strong system to get a safer environment for themselves. This makes me safer. It's crazy, but it makes me safer. Right? Stupid computer. Sorry about that, people. All right. Okay. So this is why people with ODD, sense of irritation, have absolutely no fear of punishment. Oop, question.
I was just going to say, you made that connection earlier to video games, and I feel like that relates to this too, because of that predictability piece, because of that consistency piece. If you do A, B happens every single time. And you can play it at home by yourself. You can connect to friends through the internet, so you can have that safe social life too, all through the very predictable, very consistent video game.
And I have control. I'm controlling it. Yeah, it's a great environment. I mean, for people with mental health issues, it's part of the issue in terms of why a lot of video games are addictive, right? So are cell phones. Right? Okay. So again, no fear of punishment. This is absolutely critical to get to our staff. Because, it's a very natural response when somebody gets in your face to kind of lose control of yourself. And we have got to get staff not responding that way, because all you're doing is adding more fuel to the fire. Right? I know I'm probably talking to the choir here. Cannot adequately perceive reality in those situations. So again, I've got that dopamine, serotonin kind of situation. I've got the adrenaline, all this stuff going on. I am not perceiving the world the way things are going. I'm entirely linked into myself right now, and I'm not going to be picking up cues. And I don't know how many times I'll go in and watch people try to process with these kids in a crisis. It's like, this isn't going to happen. This is not going to work. Okay? All right. So, some of the issues that add to this: domestic violence, abuse, indifference of parents, poverty. Okay? Especially, extreme poverty. At the present time in the United States, over half of our school-age populations come from families living below the poverty level. So the majority of our students coming into school are experiencing poverty. All right? Many of them are far less prepared to deal with a school that's asking more of them. Okay, so again, adding to that problem. All right? Drug and alcohol use by parents. School-based external factors: excessive punishment or punishment for behavior outside the control of the student, abuse by adults, peers, and indifference on the part of teachers. There will be teachers who kind of go, the kid deserves this. Right? And so they have some pretty poor social skills. They don't solve problems very well. And so all of a sudden they're getting rejected. They're getting, in some cases, beat up by their peers. And it's kind of like the kid needs to learn this. And we kind of turn our backs and let this kind of thing happen. If I push ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, I will oftentimes reach up into conduct disorder. Now we're talking about students that, young students who have ODD are much more likely to become juvenile offenders, okay? Conduct disorder, adolescent onset, I think we talked about this once before. We find issues of aggression and violence have two times that they come on. For some kids, it starts early. Age 3, 4, 5 years old, you already start seeing them becoming much more aggressive, much more defiant kind of issues, and that's the lifelong group. Okay? Then you get a group that in middle school, you get this late onset. Many times schools don't worry about it until the kids are big enough to be a problem. The late onset, oftentimes the problem behaviors will surge. They'll sometimes be worse than the kids who have this early onset. But by age 17 to 25, they drop down, and most of those kids will no longer display that behavior. It's just during that adolescent, young adult phase. During that time, we can't differentiate the two. Right? But it's those early starters that we really want to put some services into, because that's the ones that are going to have the longest outcome. Schools don't worry because the kids are too small. Right? They're only this big. Now, we're seeing somewhat of a change in this in terms of how many of you are seeing differences in what your schools are tolerating for restraint and seclusion. What you can do. Usually when kids were this big, I could pick them up, right? And so it wasn't a big issue. I could move them around. We can't do that so much anymore, right? And so all of a sudden schools are now starting to become more aware that maybe we need to do something else, and so that we may be seeing some changes there. All right. Conduct disorder, repetitive behaviors that violate the rights of others and societal laws, 3 or more in the following past 12 months, with one lasting 6 months. Okay. Aggression, cruelty to people or animals, that's a key one. Destruction of property, theft, running away, 12% of boys, 7% of girls. We see this one tends to become more of an issue in the community. Usually by the time kids start to display conduct disorders, the police are becoming involved, because now they're engaging usually in behaviors in the community that raises the bar, and it's not just something we're seeing at school. So these are going to be the kids who may have a probation officer, they may have different kinds of situations going on, but school still remains to become a big problem. All right. All right. What we want for those behaviors we've talked about so far: clear, brief rules. All right. Do we have clear expectations? And we've talked about this numerous times when we've talked about before. It is amazing how many times I will go into classrooms and these are not clear. So if you go into your class or you go into the classrooms where your students are, do you know what's expected right now? Do the kids know what's expected in these situations? Do I have clear rules to guide my behavior? And do I have predictable outcomes? If I do it well, is that going to be noticed? If I violate it, is there going to be a predictable outcome to that? Right? And it should be an instructional consequence, not just punishment. If the best thing you can say about your consequence is they'll think twice before they do that tomorrow, your consequence sucks. Right? We would never do that for reading. I would never go up and teaching her reading. If she makes a mistake, go up there and just smack her. All right? Now there was a time, quite frankly, whereas if you made spelling errors, we'd have brought you to the front of the room, we'd have put a pointed hat on your head, and you'd have sat in the front of the room in the dunce cap because you were simply being lazy. And by God, when you go home today, you will learn your spelling words. Okay? We taught that. That was good pedagogy. Schools of education in those days taught teachers to do this. If you would do that today, people would go, what in the hell is she thinking? Right? What was he doing that a teacher would do that? Right? I think in 10 years, hopefully, we're going to look at some of the stuff we're doing for behavior and realize we're being just equally barbaric. It makes no more sense what we're doing for behavior than what we were doing back then for academics. We need to, we've talked about this before. All right. So consistent brief rules, consistent predictable consequences. We've talked before, the ratio of praise to reprimand is the absolute most significant statistic in your classroom. If I get more reprimand than praise, I will not do as well in your class as if you change that. And that is not just correlational. We've actually gone in and if you can change that, you will change student outcomes. So verbal reprimand, verbal redirection versus acknowledgement for doing something right and praise. Okay? Most teachers think they praise more than they reprimand. The typical teacher reprimands 6 to 10 times more frequently than they praise. Now, what I find is interesting if you go in and say, do you think you praise more or reprimand more? I've yet to see the teacher who goes, oh, I reprimand more. I am damn good at it too. I am like ugly on an ape for that reprimand stuff. Okay, I got them, all right? We all think we praise more. We don't in most cases. So this is something to truly ask somebody to come in and take some data on you. If you've got a paraprofessional, say, hey, for the next 15 minutes, just kind of watch me. All right? Watch them. Okay? I'll go into the classrooms and the para sitting back, and as soon as she corrects the student, they feel like they've got to do something too, so then they throw a correction in too. Right? And it's like, he didn't need one, much less two. And now we've got, especially if he's an oppositional defiant kid, we've got a blow up. All right? Family therapy has been shown to be effective with mental health kinds of issues. All right? For many of these families, knowing how to parent, knowing how to set those clear expectations even in the home become critical. I do a lot with families. Oftentimes, the school will call me in to work with a student. I can't say, well, I'm going to go sit in this parent's home. But anytime I go past a Goodwill store, I usually will stop in if I've got time because you can pick up cassette recorders now for about $2 a pop. Nobody wants those suckers. So I'll buy any of them that they have there. I'll get 120-minute cassette recorders.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. And I'll get a 120-minute tape from a Walgreens, give it to the family and say, when are there problems? Is it homework time, bedtime, meal time? Put that tape in, put it on record, put it up on the shelf, and forget it's there. Then let me listen to the tape. Can I listen to your family interaction? And in many cases, I can then help them say, okay, here's what's going on now. This is just exacerbating the problem. Can we do something different here? And it's been pretty powerful. So it's something to think about in some cases. It wouldn't help in terms of, again, if I've got in sign language, you'd have to have video. But if you're dealing with somebody who's got language, okay. Behavior management training, social skills, social problem solving, all right. Autism spectrum. What time to go through this one? Neurological condition, okay. Developmental delays, both social communication and social interaction. Now, the dilemma comes into play is that those two situations are also characteristic of individuals with hearing impairments and children who are deaf. Separating those two things out becomes very, very difficult. Getting people who can assess that and not say, well, this is this or this is that, becomes a real challenge. But there is a high comorbidity between hearing impairments and deafness and autism. Okay? So I'm not going to read these. You've got these because you all have the handout, right? Yeah. Okay. So again, that reciprocating social interaction, problems maintaining relationships, nonverbal communication problems, all right in your wheelhouse, right? For the students that you're working with. Also for children with autism. Okay. Repetitive behaviors. This can become an issue when I'm dealing with visually impaired because oftentimes they will get into repetitive behaviors as part of dealing with their visual impairments. They will oftentimes get into self-injurious behaviors even. In some cases I was working with a little guy who would push on his eye because you get that color kind of burst. I mean, literally he pushed his eye deep into his, to where it was becoming really dangerous. Because that was a sensation, and to get that sensation, it was worth for him to do that. But again, that repetitive kind of situation is going on. Okay, it's changed. It's now 1 disorder instead of 5. We talked about that before. A couple things happened. Rett syndrome was pulled out and made its own disorder. It's not autism. It's its own disorder. Okay, the others were actually just too close to call to make any kind of realistic defensible definitions difficult to hold. So they've now you're just autism spectrum disorder. All right. All right. Higher incidence of permanent mild and permanent bilateral moderate profound hearing loss in children with autism compared to the general population. All right. But there's no correlation exists between the occurrence of hearing loss and the severity of the autism diagnosis. So there's a connection, but it doesn't predict severity. Severity doesn't seem to influence it. We just mentioned this. The problem of diagnosis becomes a challenge. We'll talk about some of the other mental health disorders. One of the challenges that we have is the fact, in this one, it's because the symptomatology is actually very similar. Some of the behaviors you would look at to say, yeah, this child's showing behaviors that would suggest autism are also common in individuals who are deaf and hearing impaired. Right? In some cases, these are all behavioral categories. It's based, there's not like a genetic test I can take to say, you get the autism gene. All right? So you display these behaviors, enough of these behaviors, you qualify for autism. They're not unique to autism. And in some cases, even trying to assess them, the terminology used doesn't translate to sign adequately. So when I'm trying to assess it and to talk to individuals who are hearing impaired, who are deaf, even getting the concepts across so that they can answer the questions, whether it's a self-rating or if I'm a deaf parent rating my child, we haven't taken the care to make these assessments. Unfortunately, the deaf and hearing population is not large enough to make some of these publication houses say it's worth making new and viable assessment tools for this population. So you do the best job you can at making things stretch, but we're not sure we can do that in some of these cases. Right?
I feel like that. Oh,
You need the microphone so it's on the tape. Dun, 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 dun.
And we don't have an assessment for it, but certainly our experience, I feel like the sensory deprivation that happens with deafness, you're missing a sense that leads to some autistic-like characteristics.
Absolutely.
And that as we give the kids the language, you see some of those things fall away.
Right.
So that's just for
Right.
whatever it's worth.
Okay. Yeah, so that, oh.
When you're done with this, it's break time.
Oh, okay. All right. Let's break now. It's a good time because we'll talk about anxiety. This is a big one. All right. 15 minutes. Okay. We'll go ahead and get started. Any questions at this point before we move on to anxiety? Anybody have questions, comments, concerns?
Just wondering if you think that the high comorbidity of autism and deafness is partially due to overdiagnosis because the symptoms do sometimes overlap or the behaviors that are displayed.
I think so the question again is whether it's overdiagnosed. I think part of the problem is we're not sure. I think one of the things that I found as I was preparing for this presentation is that this is a population that if anybody wants to take on mental health and working with this population, there are not a lot of researchers and there's not a lot to guide our practice at this point. We are punting. I think one of the things that as you read about that is that clear similarity between the disorder is clearly impacting the diagnosis. Whether it's overdiagnosis or underdiagnosis, we don't have a clue. But it's clearly a murky situation that makes any definitive determination real problematic. Other questions, comments? I think one of the challenges that come into play is that if I have comorbid hearing impairment and autism, it's going to require a different approach than just one or the other. And so trying to find that idea, to find a way to reliably diagnose and assess is probably really critical, and it's not there yet. Okay. Other questions, comments? All right, we'll move on to anxiety. This is probably one of the most challenging ones in a lot of ways for individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. And part of it's because of the issue around language as part of the treatment. Being able to recognize what's going on and utilize effective ways to self-talk is so critical in any way of assessing or of dealing with this that can become problematic. So when we talk about anxiety, again, it's those strong, really intense, strong feelings that situations are dangerous or they're threatening when they're not, okay? Now, they may be, anxiety is actually a good thing. We want stress, we want some anxiety. It actually is what we use to motivate us to do things, especially things that we don't necessarily want to do. But when that anxiety becomes overwhelming, when it actually stops me from being able to perform instead of actually helping me perform, it becomes problematic. When I see it when I say it's going to result in some kind of a dangerous or really hurtful outcome, that it stops me, then it can become very debilitating. And we are seeing this is the #1 growth area, again, of children's mental health issues in the schools, and partially because we've created that perfect environment. We've got different types. We've got a generalized anxiety disorder, and that's one of the most common. And this basically, we'll see this, and it can be mild. It can be the situation, the kid who erases things until he has holes through his paper because he's anxious of having errors. And it can be kind of a mild kind of a situation in terms of generalized anxiety. Or it can be completely debilitating from the standpoint of that, doing anything creates so much anxiety that I can't move forward. Obsessive compulsive. This is a situation where an individual has found some usually ritualistic response as a means of reducing anxiety, but it too starts to become something that gets in the way of functioning. So, I've got to wash my hands repeatedly. Things have to be in a set order, and if they're not, I can't move forward. All of those things that becomes, most of us have some sort of obsessive compulsive thing going for us. We've got little ways that we deal with stuff when we get anxious. If you want to have a fun time and looking at these kind of things, go to the airport and watch people waiting for airplanes. Okay? So there's the anxiety there, and they're twirling hair, and they're flipping legs, and they're doing all kinds of stuff that we all do as little ritualistic kind of ways. We see some people touching their arms, and they're doing some self-soothing kinds of situations. We all engage in some of these kinds of things to help us get through some anxious moments. It's when they become, again, intruding into my ability to function in the course of my daily life that it becomes a problem. All right? Panic disorders. This can be, I was working with a young lady in Middleton, Wisconsin, who was basically leaving school. She was just taking off. And in this school did an incredible functional assessment. And what they found was that she was actually having, out of anxiety, she was having panic attacks, and she was leaving the school. Now, interestingly enough, this school was suspending her before whenever she would leave school. Following this really good FBA, what they decided to do as the intervention was when she left school, they would suspend her. It's like, that's what you were doing before. It didn't work. Why would you do it now? It's like, so unfortunately, their great FBA didn't inform their plan, but they did a good FBA. All right? But again, this is a situation where it becomes so overwhelming that the person usually escapes and avoids. All right? They may leave the environment, they may just shut down. And then we have post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is probably one of the areas that we're seeing the most growth and the most increased understanding. And there's a great book called The Body Tells the Story. And it talks about stress and it talks about situations, but we know more about post-traumatic stress now than we ever have before. And it's not just a remembering. I mean, this truly, it's boom, you're back in that situation. Your brain is back going through it, and the physiological impact that has on your body is pretty dramatic. If people are not aware, there is currently a program called cbitsprogram.org. It's a website. CBIT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Interventions in the School, for Trauma in the School. CBIT, Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Trauma in the School. You can get on that website and download for free a workbook and take an online class that basically prepares you to do a cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma. It's a 10-session program that you work with kids. It also has a 2-session parent program piece to it and a teacher training piece to it. So you can get that. You become the expert of trauma kind of in your school, if you're the social worker or teacher, whoever. But then you can run things. It's been shown to be effective, and it is absolutely free right now. It's CBITS, CBITS program.org is where you download it. Okay? Yeah, there's a manual, and then there's an online course that you get once you're into it. I think they also have sites that you can actually go to a living course. It's a week-long course at various places across the United States, if that would be your option, if that would be your choice. But you can take the online course. But again, it's free, and if you're not familiar, we're going to talk this afternoon. We're going to continue going through some of the disorders. This afternoon, we're going to talk about interventions. Cognitive behavioral interventions are the gold standard for mental health issues. So if you're not familiar with cognitive behavioral, or your people don't have anybody at the school who's familiar with it, there are a lot more school-based programming available. CBITS is a nice way to get your foot up. Kind of, you can try it and get a sense of what's going on, see how that class works, those kinds of things. Okay? All right. So again, generalized anxiety. I'm going to have that, and you can read these, but restlessness, fatigue, a difficulty concentrating, all right, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbances. Young, mean age is 10 to 12, or 10 to 13, I'm sorry, and I've got basically, this is lasting about 6 months. We all worry for little times, all right, but if I've got this overarching worry that's been going on for months, it's time to be concerned. Some of the themes that are common are academics, natural disasters, right? Social life, physical assault. One of the things that we're seeing right now that's becoming a big issue for schools is how many of your schools do lockdowns? We're finding the trauma of the lockdown training is probably more debilitating than the risk that they have of somebody coming in to do a school shooting. That we're scaring the bejesus out of some of these kids, multiple times in the course of a year, and we're not sure what we're going to do about that, because there's not a school in the world that's going to say, oh, we're going to stop doing these trainings, because if there would ever be a school shooter and they hadn't been doing any training, they would hang everybody. But the cure might be worse than the likelihood of the problem. So one of the areas that people are trying to figure out is, what can teachers do to lessen the trauma and continue the training? What can we do to help prepare? How can we do things to help kids understand what's going on? It isn't there yet. We don't know what. What we're finding is just a whole lot of problems with what we're doing, but we don't know what to do about it. But at least beware of that, okay? Feeling worried, feeling tired, I can't concentrate, I'm sleepy. We'll get teachers, if all of a sudden this kid's got their head down. He's trying to escape. Right? This is escape and avoidance. Und we can't let this happen. Because if I let them escape, then I'm going to see more. I'm going to be negatively reinforcing this bad behavior. So they start pushing this kid. And if I'm doing this out of anxiety and you keep pushing me, what's likely the outcome going to be? I'm going to get more anxious, and then you're going to have the outburst kind of a situation. Right? Irregular heartbeat, sweating, muscle tension, breathing heavy, dizziness. Some of those kinds of things again, staff are not familiar with what these things look like. What should I be paying attention to? What should I be asking kids about? How do I begin to recognize that I've got somebody who might be struggling with some anxiety issues? Okay. What happens when I get anxious, and we all do this, is that you're going to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And this is a good thing. Right? Our bodies are set up for it. In fact, if I am a teacher and I've got a kid who says, this sucks, I'm not doing this shit, you're going to go into fight or flight. As the teacher, you're kind of going, oh, damn. I was really hoping they were all just going to take out their math book and work, And it's like, I could have a big problem here. And so you're going to go into fight or flight. They're going into fight or flight because you mentioned math, right? And so now you've got two people, both of them moving away from their baseline kind of a situation. So what happens literally when I'm confronted with this situation is my body gets ready for battle. the blood from my internal organs that aren't critical and from my brain get shunted out to my arms and legs so I can run or fight. Okay? My body floods with epinephrine and adrenaline, so I've got endurance and strength. It also floods with cortisol. And cortisol has two purposes. One is that it helps in case I get injured. It helps in terms of that injury from being debilitating for the short period of time. More importantly, it shuts off the upper cortex of the brain. It says this is not a time for thinking. This is a time to act. So it shuts down everything but that primitive brain that says, all right, don't think about them, bite them. All right? This is a fight issue. All right? So basically, we're kind of getting into this whole kind of situation. It allows us to avoid injury, see what's going on. All right. Okay. So all that's going on in the brain. Now again, that's all of us. That's you as the teacher, that's the kid, that's anything. If I was also a student with oppositional defiant disorder, I would also see this incredible shift right then in dopamine to serotonin at that same time. So I get this additional flood that says, I'm not worried about risk at all. All right? Added to all this other kind of stuff where I've got the primitive brain and I'm not scared of a damn thing, this is not a good combination, right? That amygdala, all right, which is about the size of an almond in the middle of our brain, that's good for emotion recognition and emotion management. Okay? Doesn't necessarily work that effectively for a number of kids with mental health issues. It's impacted in ADHD, it's impacted in autism, it's impacted in oppositional defiant disorder. In a number of these, the amygdala does not work terribly effectively. So I don't even recognize I am losing control, nor am I necessarily good at picking up that you're losing control. So I'm not going to be picking up the cues that all of a sudden you've puffed up and if I keep going, this could be bad, right? And I don't recognize in myself that something's going on. This is a huge issue in autism. And one of the aspects of self-regulation is oftentimes these individuals do not feel themselves and they have a good sense of what's going on in their body around issues of becoming upset. So most of you, if we sat down and said, when you find yourself getting scared or upset or anxious, how does your body tell you that's happening? Okay. And most of us will have things like, well, I can all of a sudden, like I can feel my ears get warm. All right? I might actually feel perspiration drip down my side of my body. All right? I'll feel my heart, I might even hear my heart beating in my head. Right? All these things tell me I am starting to get upset. I am starting to move away from things. If I had no awareness of that at all, it would be very difficult for me to start telling myself, you need to start taking a couple of deep breaths. Just, you need to start telling yourself what's going on here. All right? Why do you find yourself getting upset? Can you live with what the worst situation might be? All right, you can move forward. All of those self-regulation aspects, I would not know when to put them in place. With some of the students that you work with, they may not have the language skills or the communication aspect to know what to do to self-regulate, and may need even more direct instruction. If I've got the combination of autism and hearing impairment, now I've got an even bigger problem in terms of how do I begin to bridge that issue around teaching self-regulation. For a lot of kids, for example, with autism, they don't have the internal, so you've got to teach them what to look for out externally. I've got a little guy that I say, when you start finding yourself moving papers around, that means you've kind of moved to that yellow stage. Right? Now it's time to take a few deep breaths, to relax. When you find yourself slapping stuff, all right, now you need to ask for a break. When you want to take off your shoes, it is time to go to your safe spot. All right? And we have to teach him to look for the very behaviors we look for in him. Can we cue him to the external movements that's going on? So again, that's not unusual at all when I'm working with someone with autism, right? Because of that impacted amygdala. Now there is no issue in terms of hearing impairment that's going to impact my amygdala, per se, right? So that linguistic processing becomes the issue. And for anxiety, linguistic processing is key to treatment. So that's going to be a challenge for your population. Or it could be. Depression, I'm just going to have you guys take a minute and take a look at these, the criteria for depression, and I'll get out of your way so you can see, rather than trying to read them all. Okay, this is an area that is significantly elevated in individuals with hearing loss and individuals who are deaf, as well as those with visual impairments and who are blind. You have a huge increase in the potential and the probability that they're going to suffer from depression. So it becomes a pretty significant issue. Okay, I've got to have 5 of those 9 symptoms, all right, and for a 2-week period. And it's got to represent a change from how I've behaved before. So you've got some individuals who are just kind of like Eeyore, right? And it's like, yeah, they're just, this is a half-empty person. You know, the glass is always half empty for this person. You know, so they're just kind of like, they look like they're in a constant state of depression as opposed to, and there's not a change. They just kind of have this more negativistic view of the world. Versus the person where you see, whoa, this is different. This is not who you normally are. And so looking for those differences becomes critical. This computer's about to die. I got to get a new one. That issue in terms of depressed mood, which is irritability in children, which is somewhat different in children versus adults. Adults are kind of more lethargic and down and maybe more, grumpy, but there's this irritability and in some cases active aggression tied to depression in children. Loss of interest, pleasure, and usual activities. Symptoms are, again, a clinically significant impairment, and about 3 to 8% of normal of typical children, about twice as high in the hearing impaired population. Yep.
I was just wondering, why is there only 2 weeks that it needs to be present? It seems everything else is 6 months. Why is it only 2 weeks for depression?
That's a depressive episode.
Yeah.
So a depressive episode, it's like a minimum, so you know that is an episode, but it's not that it only has to last 2 weeks. It can last longer than 2 weeks, but it's a minimum of 2 weeks to be identified as a depressive episode. And repetitive episodes throughout the lifespan is recurrent depression.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, if you think about it, it's not like 2 weeks of being down is a long time, right? Most of us, I mean, at any given day in this room, probably a number of us are depressed about something. Last week, there was probably a whole bunch of us that were depressed, right? In terms of the weather and everything else going on, right? That's not unusual. If I'm that for 2 weeks, that's kind of unusual.
Is it if there's not, like, if I have a death in the family or something
If I have a death in the family or something like that, I feel like that explains it. So is this
Right.
like there's no explanation for why you're feeling this way?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's outside of, again, it's outside of normal expectations. So yeah, I mean, if you lost your mom just died, yeah, you're going to be down. You're probably going to be down for a while, but most of us are going to be down for a while, right? Yeah. So and again, is it significantly now? Let's say you're down and it's clearly impacting your functioning, then you may be clinically depressed, even though a normal level of depression would be typical. Yours is not normal anymore. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So some of these symptoms increase with age. Some symptoms decrease with age. All right. So it's important, again, to know some of those things, because some people will say, I think it's getting better. Well, it's getting better because those symptoms tend to change as the age cycle changes. The person's still struggling with the same issue they were struggling with before. They're just showing different symptomatology at the present time. All right? And there are some that are pretty consistent. The big challenge here is suicide. Okay? This is one of the more lethal mental health disorders in terms of that suicide and suicidal ideation, especially in children, is not unusual. Okay? And the medications generally increase the likelihood I'm going to suffer suicidal ideation. So again, identifying somebody who is depressed is an important thing to do, because you oftentimes have to put a whole series of supports in place, because this can in fact be life-threatening. And some of you may have had a student who's committed suicide. It's pretty impactful in your school system. It's pretty impactful. And unfortunately, one suicide oftentimes triggers multiple suicides. So other individuals who are depressed in the school are likely to follow suit. So it's, again, pretty critical. All right. Fourth leading cause of death in children aged 10 to 15. Third leading cause for children 15 or individuals 15 to 25 years of age. So suicide is and this is another area that we're seeing an increase. We're seeing a growth in the number of individuals committing suicide, not a decrease. So over time, we've seen this number rise. Right. Suicide attempts, 3 times more frequent in females, but far more successful in males. Right? Part of this is because males tend to take a more dramatic approach to suicide. They're more likely to shoot themselves, jump, do those kinds of things, whereas females are more likely to do overdoses and those kinds of things. They're likely to be caught and stopped. All right? Again, issues in the individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing seem to be, if my hearing loss was post age 3, okay, issues that I'm experiencing in terms of being bullied, being rejected, some of those kinds of things seem to play a role. Lack of opportunities to express and discuss my concerns. There aren't that many individuals who I can speak to, who understand sign, who I can share my ideas, my concerns with. And of those people who do have sign, many of them are not the people who are trained to handle my concerns. So I don't have the people trained out there that I need to have trained.
Did any part of the study identify the fact that most deaf children don't have communication or good communication with their parents?
Yeah, the next couple of slides, that's another huge issue for those who are earlier than that. Again, that lack of social affiliation, okay? Who do I connect with? Where's my social network? Which becomes that part of that, the whole argument for the deaf culture versus the non-deaf culture falls into these camps here around this kind of situation of, do I have that social network, that affiliation? Where do I find that? One of the things I find interesting, and I work with a school for the deaf in Wisconsin, is that the Delavan Public Schools teach sign to everybody. So in that community, pretty much everybody knows sign. So you can go to this, you can walk into the store and the shopkeepers are going to know how to sign, which I think is really powerful for changing the opportunities that those individuals have that are in Delavan. Peer rejection, okay. Internalizing mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, 3 to 6 times more likely, all right, in children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Okay. Part of that's because, again, that isolation, that lack of that social network. Okay. Some of the disorder often worsen with this, why it's important to understand this. If I do not, and I can't think of where those slides are. There's ones, oh, here it is. It's coming up, okay, good, all right. Should have been before this one, but it's after this one. I got it out of order, so we'll just take it out of order. All right, so part of the issue is that I need to identify social or mental health disorders, because if I don't, they tend to get worse. The longer I delay, the more challenging it becomes. Now, as with a lot of behavioral kinds of issues, my normative beliefs about how the world is, who I am, how things function, tend to be pretty concrete by about 5th grade. After that time, changing my normative beliefs about what's right, wrong, how the world operates is much, much more difficult. Okay? So again, getting some of this stuff identified early, getting our teachers to be aware of it, our parents to be aware of it, our service providers aware of it, and people out there who can actually do the assessments and do the treatments is critical. Right? Family relationships, family behavior, all those things. We're going to move to that next slides because that's where it kind of falls into some of these things. Prior to the 1990s, we didn't have much information at all. If you start looking up the whole issue of mental health and individuals with hearing impairments and people who are deaf or people who have visual impairments, you won't find much. There was virtually nothing done. Of course, there's not a whole lot of mental health for anybody in children's before that time, but it's virtually unheard of for this population. Assessment instruments have not been validated for this population, and the kids were basically never interviewed. Right? It was just kind of like, well, they've already got, they've got an issue. We're not going to worry about looking for other issues. Right? Here comes into this situation. So one of the things, the deficiencies in parent-child relationship seems to play a critical role. So again, if I'm a child who's deaf and I am born to a hearing family, getting that family prepared to be able to communicate and share with me is a huge, huge issue, not just for development, but also for the prevention of risk for mental health. Okay? Children who have trouble communicating with their families are 4 times more likely to be affected by mental health disorders. 4 times more likely. Okay? So again, if you're working with families, this can be another one of those things you put on your bullet points in terms of why it's important for them to get actively engaged. Okay, kind of a situation. 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, and they may not have received any usable language input during that critical language acquisition time for their brain. Right? Another issue that comes into play is parental overprotection. So all of a sudden, I've got a child who's deaf or is hard of hearing or is visually impaired, and I become so overprotective that just some of the natural kind of resiliency that they're going to have to issues, they don't ever develop those skills. And now the whole world becomes a place that may trigger anxiety. And so I have an increased risk for anxiety. It's poor learning performance, incorrect diagnosis, or failure to diagnose. And again, this is that issue of, especially that autism, hearing impaired kind of an issue. But you'll see the same thing around anxiety and hearing impaired, is that oftentimes they'll just throw everything in, well, that's just a symptom of them being hearing impaired. And they don't go any further. Lack of social involvement, social networks, increased risk for being victimized, which we talked about earlier. The time of hearing loss, okay, those who lost their hearing prior to age 3, greatest risk, family doesn't develop a reliable communication system. Those who lost it after age 3, it seems to be issues around that they had basically that it's less significant. But when we find it, it's oftentimes because of the rejection and the social network issues. Right. Huge underdiagnosis, which shouldn't surprise anybody. Okay, part of it is that there are very few experienced interpreters. Okay, so even if you were going to, you anticipated that this student might be suffering from a pretty significant anxiety disorder or depression, finding someone who could assess that would be very, very difficult. Right? Finding someone who can translate between spoken English and American Sign Language, or whatever the sign language is that the family or the child is using, or the person is using. And many of the kinds of terms that you would be looking for in that assessment don't sign well. And so getting those concepts across to say, because again, most of these are behavioral categories, right? Does this person show this? Does this person have this behavior? And so you get these checklists, but we were talking about things like issues. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, so some of those issues like feeling on edge, signing that, and I'm not a sign person, so I can't answer this, but from the literature, there are lots of these concepts that don't sign well. So you're going to be doing some translation to that, and depending upon how accurate your translation is to what they were trying to get out of the assessment, you may have completely invalidated the assessment in terms of what's going on. Issues around, yep.
And so then they ask the parents who don't really know.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, that's what ends up happening.
Right. Yeah, so they'd ask the parents or somebody who knows the person, and again, a lot of this is internal kinds of issues. How do I know what the person is feeling, right? Or issues around things like some of the psychosis. Do I hear voices? What does that mean for the deaf population? Right? So you've got whole categories where it's kind of like, do we even know what we would begin to look at?
Another problem I see often with the assessment is that the school thinks if they get an interpreter, or the hospital, or whoever it may be, that that's going to be sufficient. But the child has a very low language level that only the teacher or someone close recognizes the signs of that child. So to do an accurate assessment, it would have to involve someone who understands the sign of that child, not just this overall, we got official interpreter, right, and so everything's okay.
Right. Yeah, so again, that's that issue of that I've got language processing kinds of issues going on there. I've got my own clarity and vocabulary and range of knowledge around those concepts, and the ability to communicate that, and for somebody to communicate it to me. So it's huge. It is a huge, huge problem. So if anybody out there is looking for a place to fall in a new career, huge need, right? Okay. Another issue is that symptoms may be different. So just even how, we've got the standardized system of symptoms for the DSM-5, but not everyone shows these behaviors. You've got a cultural aspect to this and a developmental aspect to this that can dramatically impact things. So the deaf community, in terms of looking at how we express emotion, how we deal with some of those kinds of things. One study found that clinicians labeled rapid signing kind of as a sign of psychotic behavior. Right? Because they have no knowledge of what they're looking at here. And so I look at this and I go, oh, well, that looks pretty manic to me. There must be a problem here. Okay? It's just kind of like even in classrooms where you'll get the person who's banging the table, right, to get attention, and all of a sudden we're looking at that as this person's being disruptive, they're being aggressive, they're being whatever, because of just a complete lack of knowledge of the culture. Again, I don't know this for sure, but it says there are a few signs within the sign language that account for subtle changes in mood, okay, which are critical in the assessment for mental health issues. So if I can't assess that because I don't have language for it, that's going to be an issue. Okay? I know one of my degrees is in medical anthropology, but I had a course in cognitive behavior, cognitive anthropology, in which you study a culture by looking at this language. And so the number of words that, for example, Eskimos have over 100 words for snow because that's incredibly important for them to understand all the differences in snow. We don't have that many words, this is not important. So looking at a culture's language in terms of just how many terms and words they have for things tells you a lot about that culture and what can and can't be described. Weirdly enough, a lot of your tribes in the Amazon only have 3 colors. They have green, not green, and blue. That's all they need, right? How many colors do we have? I mean, Crayola would go broke in the Amazon, right? Shit, we only sell 3 crayons, right? But so it's kind of like so it's that whole issue, and that seems to play a role here, in that some of those necessary language cues aren't equally translatable in terms of sign language. Okay, so again, part of the identification, differentiating between issues around language systems issues and neurological kinds of problems. What are we looking at here? Right? When you go into individuals with visual impairments, oftentimes people will say, oh, well, that's a visual impairment. That should impact language. But we know it does. It impacts language considerably in terms of what my exposure is to the world, in terms of what's going on, in terms of the development of the richness of language. My ability to process is impacted. And so you get those same kinds of concerns that we have with the deaf and hearing impaired with the visually impaired. Okay. Limitations to their visual input. So again, as I begin to talk about symptomatology, my experiences, I'm going to have a limited ability to express some of that based upon the limitations I've had in my own development and understanding of the world and of my place in the world. Right? Right. High incidence of psychiatric disorder in blind children, part of that may be the fact that we're trying to use symptomatology of sighted individuals, and individuals with hearing impairments are going to, or visual impairments oftentimes will display behaviors that would be symptomatic in a sighted person. And we're not differentiating those. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So that whole assessment issue is a big deal. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about treatment. This is where we get in trouble with schools, is the fact that, again, not only do we have the issue that schools don't necessarily want to take on mental health issues, part of that we're not necessarily equipped for it, and in some cases there's aspects that are important that we don't have any real say in. So we know for effective treatment of many mental health issues, it's going to take do I have that effective academic and social emotional instruction? Now that should be a yes for us. We should be able to say, yes, that's something we can do. It's not. In many of our schools, we have jettisoned the social emotional curriculum almost entirely in favor of academics. And we've got teachers who are feeling incredibly compelled to teach at the grade level they're teaching, irregardless of the skill level of the students. So we're seeing situations in which there is absolutely no concern for a match between skills, the student's ability, and what we're asking them to do. So we've, again, part of the dilemma then becomes we've increased a situation for anxiety on both the part of the staff and on the part of the students. And anxiety in either one will intensify the anxiety in the other. So if I'm a student who's likely to become anxious and all of a sudden the teacher is showing anxiety, I'm going to become more anxious. If I've got a student who's anxious and I'm a teacher who's likely to become anxious, I'm going to become more anxious as a teacher, and we will start just filling each other up in terms of that kind of situation. One of the other challenges we have for that social emotional learning is that most school social workers, where are my social workers? Raise your hands again. Okay. Unfortunately, most school social workers kind of lump together a whole bunch of fun stuff, and this is my social skills program. And they do not say, look, I need to have an empirically validated social skills program. There are about 260 published social skills programs out there. Less than 10% have ever been studied to see whether or not they're effective. Of those that have been studied, many of them did not prove to be effective, but the publishers didn't change a damn thing. They were just hoping it would be so they could say, this is empirically validated. It wasn't, so they don't say it was. But they just keep publishing the same thing. There are a number of them that are empirically validated. And do I actually implement a validated intervention? We don't let teachers do this with reading anymore. We don't let teachers do this with math. I don't know why we let people do this with social skills, all right, and social problem solving. So one is, do I have an empirically validated program? Then the issue comes, is it got any validation with the populations you're working with? Because they live in a different world to a certain extent, okay? So I always say the one thing you never want to be, a number of things you don't want to be born, but one thing you don't want to be born is as a child of a university professor, okay? Because you do things to your children that no normal person would do. So one of the areas of my research was social skills. And so when my daughter was about 10, we went and liberated a wheelchair from the local hospital, and we went to the mall. And my daughter's this kind of, when she was that age, was this kind of cute little redheaded girl, and we sat her down in the mall, and I hid behind plants and stuff like that with a camera. And I videotaped people walking up as she was standing there, and you would see people smiling at her, saying hi, this kind of thing. And then I plopped her in a wheelchair. Same kid, same everything, but now she's in a wheelchair. And I'm videotaping people as they come up to her now. What do you think you see different? Okay. You don't look. Because we've been taught you don't look at people with disabilities. And so they didn't have eye contact. They weren't coming up and saying hi. They weren't doing anything. She stopped being. For the most part, she got no interaction. Okay, now, I do not know of a single social skills program that talks about how the hell do I get people to look at me. Most of our social skill programs are developed for kids who are typical kids with no big issues. That's not who some of us are teaching. So the dilemma comes, not only do I have a program that's empirically valid, but is it empirically validated for the population I'm working with? And I don't have a lot to tell you in terms of what's been shown to be empirically validated for the deaf and hard of hearing population. There may be something, and if people know about it, let me know. But that's a big issue. Behavioral interventions. We want to have good, clear behavioral interventions. People need to know about situations. Again, that ratio of praise to reprimand. You have a choice as a teacher, as a staff member, all of your teachers that work with your kids can choose to be sticks or carrots. We need them to put the sticks away and be carrots. Okay? Every child I've ever worked with, and I've worked with some of the most challenging kids that I think people can come up with, I have yet to ever come up to a kid who did not show more positive or neutral behavior than bad behavior. Now, God knows some of their bad behavior was pretty bad, right? And it would be very hard to ignore this behavior, but they showed more positive. We choose what we're going to attend to. If I attend to that positive, I'm likely to increase that positive. If I attend to the negative, I'm probably not going to be terribly successful. Right? So understanding reinforcement, understanding antecedents and behaviors and consequences, that's all really critical. So I can develop an environment that will host good development. Right? But mental health disorders do not respond well to applied behavior analysis techniques in and of themselves. Okay? You need cognitive behavioral interventions. And this is an area that schools are terribly behind in developing. We need school social workers, we need teachers to begin to have a relatively good foundation of cognitive behavioral interventions. And the issue here is it's not just the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. It's the antecedent and the thoughts that triggers, and how that leads to behavior and the consequences, and how both of those things come back and reinforce not just the behavior, but those thoughts. And when I'm going to intervene now, I intervene with the thoughts, not just the behavior. So if all of a sudden I'm standing here and the two of them are talking, and they're looking at me and they're talking and they're laughing, is what I'm telling myself is that they're laughing at me, and I've got to go over there and slap them both, because that's the only answer I can have, because you don't laugh at me, all right? Then you've got to help me realize that just because two people are looking and talking and laughing doesn't mean they're laughing at you. That's a thought distortion. That's a misperception of the world, all right? And what we see is a lot of schools who are good at this behavioral thing, and they will put some kind of a consequence in place, but they never get at processing those thoughts. And with mental health, that's going to be a problem. The last one we have no say on, medication. And bottom line, we need to understand medication, and we generally, many times, don't. We can't prescribe. We're not supposed to even talk about medication in terms of what's going on with parents in this kind of situation. I'll be real honest with you, when I work with families, I generally try to share material on medication. I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but here's medication, here's what's going on, what's happening. But I know I need to know about medications. I need to know what medications my kid's on. And in your FBAs and BIPs, that should be noted. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This was out of place again. I should have gone through this better. There was a situation where they've translated an anxiety scale into the British Sign Language. So, and that's the only thing I could find, and I don't know, people may know of other ones, but this is the only mental health measure I've found that anybody has attempted to make a translation into sign language and actually tested its validity. They did it for the British Sign Language, these particular measures, and they found that they actually could do that and come up with a reliable measure. So that's hopeful, but we need to have that done with American Sign Language, right? Sorry, that slide's out of place. All right. Okay. We talked last time a little bit about escape and avoidance. We're just going to review a few things on that because if I am suffering from anxiety, if I am suffering from depression, if I am suffering from ADHD, I will oftentimes engage in behaviors that you as teachers will say, oh, this is escape and avoidance. Right? In schools that do FBAs and BIPs, which are all schools, I guess, at this point, although I was in Wisconsin not too long ago and talking to a bunch of social workers and talking about FBAs, and the one social worker said, well, how long has this been something we're supposed to be doing? I said, since 1997. All right. So escape is the number one function you guys identify. 67% of school-based FBAs identify escape and avoidance as the primary function of the behavior. Okay? Which doesn't surprise me because by its very nature, school asks kids to risk. Right? I'm constantly putting you in a situation where I'm going to push your knowledge point. I'm going to ask you to try something you're not necessarily familiar with. I want to get that acquisition level. There's a risk aspect to that. All right? And sometimes I think because we're being pushed to push the curriculum, we don't take the care to have anything even close to an 80% correct rate that like the video games are looking at. And so I'll go into classrooms and kids will have a 20 or 30% correct level of responding and the teacher's surprised they don't want to play this game. And it's like, no, you're telling him every day how stupid he is. Why would I want to do this? I don't want to do this game. I don't want to play this at all, okay? So when I start to say I'm not going to do that, I become non-compliant, I begin to fight. Again, the teachers see this from a behavioral view. You're trying to escape. If I allow you to escape, I'm reinforcing this behavior. Therefore, I can't possibly allow you to escape, and I'm going to push you. And when I push you, and especially when it's a mental health issue, what's going to happen is the kid's going to escalate and explode. Okay? So part of what I have to do is think seriously about escape. All right? And I know I did this before, but there are a few new people here, so we'll go through it again because I think it's critical for this part of the thing. Is escape a basic human need? Think so? Yeah? No. Escape is a primal response if you threaten a basic need. All right? So think about good old Maslow, right? Do you see escape anywhere on there? No, he identified a whole series of needs. So, physiological, safety, love and belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization. If you threaten those, especially some of the primary ones, I will go into that fight or flight situation, I will try to escape. That's a primal response. So when you have a student who is engaging in escape behavior, you've got a function, but that's not enough to develop a plan. Now I've got to say what need is being threatened that this kid feels they have to escape. Is it safety? Is it competence? Is it autonomy? Those are the three key ones. Usually you threaten one of those, I want to escape. All right? And my plan has to address that need, not the escape. Right? So if it's a safety issue, I've got to reduce threat. If it's competence, I've got to give this student something they can do effectively. If it's autonomy, I've got to give them some choice. Right? I've got to build that ability for them to have some autonomy into the process. I've got to look at that underlying need. Okay? Okay. So fear is a big one. Kids come into school. School can be a very fearful place. Again, I was in a classroom, I think I mentioned this last time, but it was one of my greatest examples of this. It was a preschool classroom, I think. It may have been a first grade or a kindergarten. But a little guy ran out of the room, like they're likely to do now. Ran down the hall, ran into the teacher's lounge, and as he slid into the teacher's lounge, grabbed a butter knife off the counter. Slid under the table there, where the teachers had a couple of tables pushed together where they sit around for lunch and stuff. He's under the table with a butter knife. 4 teachers come running in. They're all bent over, all of them trying to grab him while they're trying to get him out from under the table. Now, if I'm under the table and I got a butter knife, what need do you think I might be showing? This is a safety issue. I'm not feeling particularly safe. I've got a knife and I'm hiding, right? 4 people all trying to grab me probably has nothing to do with anybody looking at my need. Whose needs were they trying to deal with? Their needs. Never going to be effective. Okay? All right. So kids come into school, sometimes they're afraid of failure. You've got kids, if you give them too many messages of failure, they're out of there. Screw you, I'm not doing this shit, right? They're shutting down, they're getting up, they're running around. Fear of the teacher. I walked into a classroom, into a school in Northwest Indiana. And as I walked around the school, there were all of these posters for kindness. Kindness. Be kind. Flowers. It was beautiful. And I'm walking, and as I'm walking through, all I'm hearing are people yelling. And one paraprofessional has a kid against the wall going, "Go ahead, roll your eyes at me." And I'm just standing there, and finally I'm going, there's no kindness here. So I actually went and got the social worker and the principal, because I knew them, and I said, "I want you to come with me." I said, "Pretend you've never been in this school before. I want you to walk through and tell me what you're hearing." I said, "Does this sound like kindness to you?" And I said, "Not only is it not kind," I said, "this is worse than not kind. Because by all these posters, you're telling every child here, we recognize the importance of kindness, but you don't deserve it." And I think we have to start becoming incredibly cognizant of how we sometimes set ourselves up to not do what we say we think is important to do. All right? But there are teachers who are just scary damn teachers. Right? There are teachers who are screamers. All right? And you generally don't see people go into the teacher's lounge going, "Wow, heard you screaming all the way down the hall. Can I help you in any way?" Right? Which you usually hear things like, "It was that Anderson kid, wasn't it? I had the brother, the whole damn family's like that." Right? We almost support each other in being rude. Right? Okay. Fear of peers. Many of your kids are rejected, they're actively bullied. Okay. This is not a place where I've got a support system of peers. This is a place where I'm fearful of peers. Fear of the unknown. Okay. New material. New activities. How many of you would like it if and some of you probably would. You're sick people. No. If we're going to do all kinds of interactive kinds of stuff. How many of you love that in workshops? I love the interactive stuff where we've got to get up and risk and do all kinds of fun stuff. Most of us are like, "Nope, I want to sit and get. I'm fine. Just tell me what you want me to know." Okay. I hate workshops that make me go up and do stuff. Okay. Frightening locations. In a typical school, there's at least one child in most schools who do not use the bathroom the entire day out of fear of what goes on in that bathroom. Okay. Okay. And post-traumatic events. Okay, we've got a lot of kids who are coming in who are having. I'll get into classrooms and the teacher will go, "I wasn't doing anything to her. All of a sudden she's having this meltdown over here. There was nothing going on with her. Right? But I just got done screaming at her, and in her family, when voices go up, the next thing that happens is people start getting hit. So I just triggered all kinds of stuff in this student, even though I wasn't working with this student at all." Okay. So what we want to do for response is basically, I want to have threat reduction. All right. How do I stand? I was working at one school. It was really kind of cute, and the teacher was doing this young lady kind of a thing, right? And has her hands punched right here, kind of a thing. She was. The little kid goes, "I'm not afraid of those bitch wings." I thought, I love that. I've never heard that term. I like it. Okay? All right? But this was clearly not indicating any kind of care or concern to this child, right? Kind of a situation. What did that trigger, right? So how am I standing? What am I doing to show threat reduction? What am I doing to show I'm with you, not trying to just be something here, kind of a situation, all right? So feelings of safety, distance. The people who will go when a kid is unsafe, and I think I've got a relationship. So I go, it's going to be okay, you're going to be all right. And it's like, whack, right? Not then, right? This is the time for give some space. I don't care how good your relationship is, you're going to get popped, right? Kind of a situation. Help teachers realize that in some cases. Right? Reassurance. Okay? And we talked about this last time, but again, it's critical. And when we come back from lunch, we're going to actually play a little, we are going to do a little playing with some stuff. What we really want to do is get our teachers to have as almost a knee-jerk reaction when I see a kid starting to escalate, because we're going to see more of this. We see this with the anxiety, we see this with the depression. I've got to stop trying to control it and realize I can't control anything but me. But what I can do is create an environment in which I'm going to influence the likelihood that this student is going to do something more effective than blow up, okay, and move towards crisis. So one of the first things I want to do is, can I try to connect with that need? Can I do some kind of reassurance? I want you to feel safe. I want you to be okay. Not I need you to do math. That's not their need, that's your need. I want you to be all right. Okay? So can I show them that I'm with them? And then can I give them two? Now, the importance of two is that there's always a possibility that autonomy is an issue. When I give you two choices, I'm giving you choice. I'm going to give you some autonomy. And I want to craft two choices that meet that need. So if it's safety, and safety is a tough one, because as teachers, we don't want to give up anything. So sometimes with safety, what I've got to give is the gift of time and space. And I don't want to give time and space because I don't have any time and space. But that's what the kid needs right now. All right? But can I, I want you to feel safe. I'll tell you what, I'm just going to give you a couple minutes. I'll come back and check with you in just a little bit. Or there's a desk at the back of the room. Why don't you go on back there, have a seat, and I'll get with you as soon as I can. Which would work for you? Okay. So, I mean, and how many times do you, we'll do, I get called a lot into stuff that when things have gone way south. And part of the issue is like talking to the, what happened? Well, the kid said, leave me alone. It's like, okay, did you do anything about it? No, I kept right in his face. I think he kind of told you what he needed, right? Leave me the fuck alone. Oh, all right, okay, kind of. All right, can we give him that gift of time and space? All right, kind of a situation. All right. This is another key one for schools is frustration. Again, by its very nature, we are constantly asking kids to do something that they may fail at. How many of you go home at night and willingly choose to do something you don't do well and that you may fail at? Most of us, now you may have to. I'm not saying that, I don't want to do dishes, but I have to do dishes. I don't want to do laundry, but I have things that you willingly want to do that you don't do well. Okay? Most of us as adults don't do that very often. We kind of stay clear of some of that stuff. We do a pretty nice pathway to where we don't have a lot of those kinds of things that we willingly do. In school, kids don't have much say. I've got to do math even though I don't do math well. I've got to write even though writing is tough for me, right? Those kinds of issues. So, challenging work may frustrate me. Unfamiliar topics, lack of knowledge or skill, too many errors, too many reprimands, okay? So, all of those can create frustration. How many of you have kids who blow up because they're frustrated? Okay, this is a big one, right? This is pretty common, right? For this, I want to, come on. I want to lend control. I want to give them some sense of being able to control what's going on in this situation. Okay? So again, I'm doing that same kind of thing, all right? I want to remain calm, I want to be competent, I want to reassure them, all right? Stan, I want you to be successful at math. Bill, I want you to do well in writing, all right, whatever's going on. And then, can I provide those two clear choices? Let's turn back to the math we were doing yesterday, because you were doing that well. Let's do a couple of those, see how we get here. Or we can go get a drink of water, come back, I'll work with you. Which would work for you? Okay. Now, what you need to do is, in your behavior plans, for some of these kids who are likely to do this, is you need to really lay this out. And in some cases, you might actually even have to identify what are some common requests that the kid is likely to do. So I know math is a trigger. So if you know math is a trigger, this is one of the situations going to end up in, what could we do if all of a sudden he's putting a stall in around math? What do we know he can do pretty effectively that we could craft as the two options? Because in the moment, you too are going to move into fight or flight. So all of a sudden I say, I'm not doing this shit. You're going to go, oh my God, right? And you're going to move away from your baseline, and now is not a time that you're going to think, oh God, what does he like to do? What do I think I get him to do? This is not going to be a good time for you to be processing thinking either. So this becomes part of, in that BIP planning, you may have to think about what are some of those possible options. So what we're going to do over lunch when we're thinking about it is think about some of the kids that you're working with. Think about what are some of those triggers, especially if it's subjects or situations. What could you craft as options? And we're going to share some of those when we get back after lunch. But I want you to seriously think of a kid. Think of the one or two kids that you're going, God, I get called on this kid all the time, or I'm constantly dealing with this kid. What are the triggers? What are the issues? And what could you craft? All right. Autonomy. All right. And again, this is that oppositional defiant disorder child. Oftentimes, autonomy is critical for this kid. I need to have some ability to control what's going on. If things start to look like they're spinning out of control, it scares me to death. I have got to have some level of autonomy and control in this situation because this is not a safe world. People don't like me. People want to hurt me. All right? And I've got to be in control. And this is where you get the kid engaging in sometimes pretty inappropriate behavior. All right? Because it makes that world predictable. Help your teachers realize that. And if I've got a kid who's doing that a lot, that should be an indication that I'm putting them in a world that for them is pretty unpredictable. And this might be a situation where I really have to be much clearer about expectations, clearer about consequences, so that they understand what's coming. All right? Because what they're doing right now is crafting a world they can feel comfortable with and be predictable about, but makes everybody else's life miserable. Okay? So you're asking them to read and teach us read. They perceive that you're attempting to control them. You're trying to control me, and that makes me less than safe. I'm going to take control. I'm going to act out in a way that will allow you to become predictable. Okay. What staff see is this really mad, angry, big, tough kid, right? He's trying to rule my world. He's trying to make my life miserable. He's trying to do that. He's going to try, and by God, in this classroom, I'm in control, not him. I can't allow him to control everything. But what you've really got is this scared little kid in there who's just trying to make their world safe. I've got to get staff to see that scared little kid and address that kid. Okay. All right. Noncompliance. This is the number one reason kids get restrained and secluded. It starts with noncompliance, and ultimately someplace somebody touches somebody, and oftentimes it's the staff that touches the kid first, and it becomes into some way physical that will allow the person to somehow justify restraint and seclusion. And this is a really, really hot issue. Your population actually gets restrained and secluded as a very high numbers. Kids in special education as a whole get restrained far more. Kids with special needs make up 12% of the population of students in the United States and 75% of the kids who are restrained and secluded. And your population is one of the leading populations in that group of special education students that are getting restrained and secluded. So noncompliance is a key one for that kind of a situation. I've got to, again, realize I can't not control the kid. I can only control me. Do I have a sense of my own self-control plan? And truly, I think every teacher that works with kids needs to have truly a formal self-control plan. So like literally mine is, I tell myself one more day, because I used to work in a residential treatment center where the therapist that worked with our boys would say, Rick, you've only got to hang into the intervention one day longer than they think you're going to. Like, oh, I can do that, right? Okay. So I tell myself one more day, I take a deep breath, and I have to touch my fingers together because that sort of grounds me, okay? Now I may have to do that 10 or 15 times in a crisis, but I've got to stay as close to my own baseline as I possibly can, right? Now I was in a class not too many months ago where a teacher was working with a student with autism, and the student they were asking the kid to do something, and this was a student who had some cognitive issues also. I think got fed up, didn't have a lot of language or communication, couldn't indicate he was tired of this activity, and decided to take a swing at the teacher. Now it was a wide table. He didn't actually hit her, but he swung at her. This was a school, unfortunately, that was using a punitive intervention strategy, and they were going to use, they basically would take his hands, and it was contingent restraint. They held his hands down for 10 seconds. All right, so I'm sitting across the table's relatively wide, the teacher's got my hands on the table's too wide for me to kick her, too wide for me to headbutt her. What the hell do I have left? Spit. Big old hocker right in the teacher's face. Whoomp, right? Most of us would rather be hit than spit upon. Okay? Now this was the time for the teacher to use her self-control plan. But she didn't. She reached across the table, picked him up and just pulled him up over the table, and they were off to the races. Okay? And she's in huge trouble. Okay? Kind of a situation. Very human, not where we need to be. So we are working with an at-risk population. We're working with a tough group of kids, especially if you've got a student with mental health issues. You better have staff clearly developing a self-control plan. Questions, comments, or concerns at this point? Anybody care? We all right?
Great. You're doing great.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and go on. Well, then we're going to give you guys a little chance to talk a little bit here and play a little bit. But first, I want to start thinking about the whole issue of escalation. Even the most conscientious, dedicated teacher is going to have times in which a student escalates. Okay? So part of the issue is that I always like to kind of think about if you're going down the road, you're on your way to a wedding, you're all dressed up, you're looking good, and all of a sudden you see steam coming out of the seams of your engine. What does that tell you how to do? Yeah. First you go, you say shit, right? Okay. Maybe I need to go faster because then I'll get cool air coming through my engine and cool things down. Would that be good? Be a good plan? All right, not a good plan. Okay. I'll just get out, I'll do what this guy did, just open that thing right away. Is that a good idea? No, because then what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to scald my hand, I'm going to lose all the steam, and even when the car cools down now, I'm not going to have enough water to go forward. What do I have to do? I've got to sit and wait. As much as I don't have time to, I don't want to, anything else, I have to sit and wait. Okay? I try to help teachers realize that while there's no steam coming out of the engine, this little guy is selling the same thing, right? The only thing I can do is sit and wait. I've got to give this kid the gift of time and space, right? And that truly, and I know as teachers we don't have time, right? But the issue is that if I push him, what's going to happen? Then I'm going to get an escalation, and I'm probably going to spend a whole lot more time. And I was reading somewhere where they figured that the typical, if it gets to the point of somebody having to be restrained or secluded, that by the time it's all said and done, it's about $1,200 in staff time to handle a simple restraint and seclusion situation. Okay? And I didn't get anywhere anyhow, right? Kind of a situation. So helping staff realize that it's okay to give people the gift of time. We've seen this before, but it's so important. We've got this crisis cycle. People have to realize, and we have to get staff to understand it. And we have to get staff to be able to recognize, where is my child at any given point on that cycle? So things are going along, and all of a sudden there's a trigger. Now, as you're doing your FBAs, one of the things we're supposed to be doing is looking for those triggers, right? Anybody here ever not found a trigger? Yeah, sometimes you can look and look and look and I can't find anything that's, in some cases, what's the trigger is anxiety. And it's no one thing. Any number of issues can trigger that anxiety. I'm kind of this basket kid. And I'll oftentimes sit, if we had more space, I'd have done it here. I oftentimes bring a vase and I'll like pour water in it and say, okay, I got up late and my mom yelled at me. Okay? My little brother was teasing me in terms of what's going on, and I just keep pouring glasses of water in until the vase is basically filled to the very top. And now I come into school. And the teacher says, where's your homework? And there is no room for that glass of water to go, and it just overflows. And I think we've got to realize that for many of our kids, they're coming in with their vase already full. There is no room for anything more. And the slightest issue will trigger them. And all of a sudden, they're just going, well, I don't know why they're losing it. All right? Well, they already came loaded for bear, kind of a situation. So helping realize that sometimes it's anxiety and that kids have got it before they've ever come on. How many of you have the kid when they get off the bus and their hair's like, and you're going, oh shit, one of those days, right? And literally, I've got students who have 2 IEPs or two BIPs. This is the hair like this BIP, and this is the hair's comb BIP, right? Or this is when he's staying with mom, this is when he's staying with dad, this is when he's medicated, this is when he's not medicated. And you truly, I mean, it is a different set of expectations. It is a different plan. And for some of our kids with mental health issues, you may have multiple plans, especially if parents or whatever is dealing with medication issues. So part of what I've got to realize again is that fight or flight, that as I go up, my cognition goes down. All right? And we have to help teachers realize, as I'm moving up, this is not the time to try to process this. Right? You'll get the kid who kind of goes, this is bullshit, I'm not doing this crap. And the teacher goes, you cannot cuss in my room. I always want to say, were you deaf? He just did. Didn't you hear him? And the minute I say, you can't cuss, what am I doing? I'm taking a red flag and kind of throwing it in front of the person. They're going to do more of the behavior. So I've got to help people realize when they're moving up in the escalation, what I've got to do is try to figure out what the heck is going on here, and can I relieve the pressure in terms of meeting the need. All right? I'll see teachers who kind of go, the kid, it's math. Take out you're doing the math, page 119. Math sucks, I'm not doing this shit. You can't swear. F you, and then they tear up their paper. All right? Then you can't tear up your paper, you're going to pick up all that stuff off the floor. And the kid flips over his desk, right? And he is sent to the office. When you are sent him to the office, what do you send him to the office for? What's he being sent to the office for usually? Okay. For what? Why is he seeing the principal? What's the behavior? Insubordination. Usually it's the last. And when you look at, I mean, your school, I don't know, how many of you work at schools that have PBIS as a system that you're working with? Or, oftentimes schools will utilize office referrals as their data source. Office referrals virtually have nothing to do with student behavior. It has everything to do with teacher tolerance. What I really get a measure of is, when do teachers say, I've had enough, he's going to the office, all right? It often never tells me what the problem was. So I'm being set down for insubordination. What's the problem? Math. Did that come in anywhere? If you truly want to solve my issues, what do you got to work with? You've got to help me understand math, right? Deal with that frustration kind of around that situation. So I need to figure out what's going on, and as the student is moving up, and oftentimes we're pushing them, their cognition is going down. This is not, again, not a time to try to solve this. And I'll get teachers who go, well, if I don't say something about his swearing, they're all going to start swearing. It's like, yeah, no, they're not. All right? And first of all, I can teach every student in my class about this cycle. And I can say, we are going to deal with the behavior that triggered, but we're going to deal with it when kids can learn. We're going to deal with it at the end, not at the beginning. So yeah, you're not going to hear me try to deal with this now, because it wouldn't be, first of all, it wouldn't work, and it's not caring for you. And my job as a teacher is to care. So we'll deal with it, but we'll deal with it when you can actually learn. Okay? Now I want to get the crisis over. I want to move out of that cycle and back down to baseline. Okay? So the blood is shunting from the brain, going to the arms and limbs. Cortisol is going through here. This is not a time to be trying to talk to me while I'm in the crisis. Right? This is also not a time, you'll get the BCBA sometimes to go, oh, but if you do it, you're reinforcing that inappropriate behavior. First of all, we're not saying this is going to be the new behavior plan. We'll do this every time. This is a crisis. We're going to sit down and go, why did we get here? What did we screw up? Did we not have something in the plan? Did somebody not follow the plan? Was it a bad plan? You know, this isn't like we're going to do this every time for all the time for the rest of our time. This is getting through this crisis. We'll fix this. We'll do something to fix the issue as we get through this. Right now, I want to get off the crisis. All right? And this is not the best time for learning anyhow. This is not when this kid's going, oh, wow, I'm picking up every one of these little nuances here. They're not thinking all that clearly right now. When I would pick on the person who had to sing, and the very first thing, I usually would say, what did your colleagues do when I asked you to sing? They don't have a clue, because they were into fight or flight. They didn't even see what you guys were laughing at them, right? Because they were into themselves at that point. So the other issue that happens is that whether you like it or not, you are going to move away from your baseline as a staff member. And the staff member who tells me, nope, I've been doing this so long, it's like ice water going through my veins. It never bothers me. I always say you're either dealing with a pathological liar or a psychopath. And you want neither of them on your faculty, okay? You are going to move away. Now, if I have a self-control plan, I can minimize how far away I move. I can reduce the movement, but I am going to still move away. And as I move away, my cognition too is going to be impacted. And I have to realize that. And we have to have our schools realize the more we're dealing with more challenging kids, more kids with mental health issues, we've got to get staff realizing you have to have that self-control plan, you've got to use it. And we have to have a code. So if I come in and all of a sudden I see you as a staff member are actually throwing gas on this fire, I've got to have a way to get you to step back. All right? So we would use things like, you've got a call in the office. Right? And what that meant was you're breaking off. Whether you agree with me or not, you are backing off, I am taking over. If we're going to make an error, we're going to err in favor of the child. All right? We can discuss this later if you disagree. We were in one school and it was like, you got a call in the office, and the person says, can't you see I'm busy? Take a message. And we're like, it's HR. Oh yeah, I remember now. Okay. Excuse me. So, work on a code. Right.
I don't want to talk to anyone.
Let me go back here for a minute. Here is where you're going to deal with the problem. Okay? Once people are back to baseline, you're okay, they're okay. Now we can go, okay, Randy, I know you had a hard time with math. Math's a tough issue for you. You know, and you told me to do something that was physiologically impossible for me to do to myself. Okay? That's not necessary. Okay? Here's what we're going to do, and we give some solution. And here, maybe there's going to be a slight consequence for what they did. And again, think about, does this consequence teach me anything? Is this instructional? You know, so we'll do things like, you know, so there's a lot of stuff now in terms of you know, kind of remediation kinds of aspects, you know, or different kinds of ways that I have to reconnect to the community in some way, whoever I've offended, those kinds of things, something that teaches me something. All right, this stupid thing is going to keep popping up. All right. Your area of greatest influence is that right there as the escalation goes on. That's where I've got to get teachers to begin saying, okay, this is where I want to issue that. I want you to be successful. We can do X or we can do Y. Okay? Right as the quicker I get in there, and if somehow a student says, I'm not going to do either one of those, that doesn't mean you have to go, well, yes, you are. Those are the two choices I gave you. Right? Maybe I've got to step back and go, okay, I didn't catch the need. Can I offer two more? Can I give them, you know, I'm going to give you some space. Sounds like you need a little bit of space here. Just chill. I'll be back in a few minutes. All right? Again, can I give that gift? Usually, if you give a kid a pathway to competence, they'll take it. Right? Your job is to craft that pathway. So what I'd like you to do is to take a few minutes here, all this stuff you guys hate to do. We're going to talk to our partners, the people at our table. What I want you to do is literally think about a kid. You don't have to share his name or her name, but think about a student. What are those key areas that tend to be triggers, tend to be areas that are going to cause that fight, cause this escalation. And what could you help staff, the teachers and staff that work with that child, think about as ways to craft two options that might get at that underlying need? So think about what are the issues? Is it safety? Is it competence? Is it autonomy? Is it something else? What could you offer as two options that meet that student's need at that time? All right? Then I'm going to ask for a couple of you to share out what you came up with. So spend some time, seriously, think about a given child. Make this a time that you're going to go back with something that you can actually add to an IEP. All right, would anybody like to share their student, a little bit about their student and maybe what they might suggest as two options? Don't all volunteer at once? Where are the courageous people? Now they're doing the thing. They're not looking at you. They're not looking at you so that they. Come on, somebody must have courage. How about you? No. No? Sure.
Well, the one that we were working on, it's very. The one we were working on, it's very low-key type of crisis. It's not he expands into an outburst or anything like that. It's more like, I don't want to do this.
Okay.
But he doesn't escalate to, throwing chairs or anything like that. He basically just shuts down.
Okay.
So this is a middle schooler who's going through the crisis of, why do I need to know this math? Am I ever going to use this? Kind of thing. So working with the student, it's like, yeah, I kind of see your point, but you still have to do this math kind of thing. So we were just kind of brainstorming, like, well, what can you do to help him come to terms with that? So we were trying to figure out, is it a safety issue? Is it a competency issue? Could be a little bit of both.
Right.
So
Right.
that's as far as we got.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that, and oftentimes the work, it's like, much better to be bad than stupid, right? I'm having to risk in front of people. And motivation is usually, it's the result of, am I interested? And do I think I'll be successful? And if either of those is zero times anything is zero, right? So if I got absolutely no interest, I'm probably not going to get engaged. And if I don't feel I'm going to be successful at all, why would I want to try this? And so sometimes it's an issue, sitting down and saying, okay, where are we at in that equation even? Is there anything I can do to make it more interesting? Is there anything I can do to make sure he's likely to be successful? But those are the two things you've got to manipulate in that kind of a situation. But again, is it competence? Is it control? I want to have some control over the situation. All right. Somebody else? Who's got somebody who really has a huge challenge? Come on, got to have one. All right, we got one over here.
So I feel, first of all, in our discussion that I wasn't able to answer all of these questions because I don't know what to do for this child, but she is sixth grade in a district that there are not very many deaf or hard of hearing children in the school or even in the district. She's one of only 2 kids in the school that wears hearing aids, and there's like 300 kids in the school, so it's very like low incidence and everything in the area. But she's been working with me for the last 3 years, and for the last year, I feel almost that I have been her trigger. She has a very rough home life. Like there's a lot of things going on at home, so she might be one of those kids where her vase is already full when she sees me. But like we'll come to school, I get her first thing in the mornings on a couple days because school is very strict about when I'm allowed to pull her. And I'll be like, good morning, how are you? And her response is bad because I have to see you. I'm like, okay, I haven't even done anything yet. But so I almost feel like seeing me is her personal trigger. Like I tried putting like positive behaviors and everything in place in the classroom. She gets rewarded like just for like being like respectful, bringing her hearing aids and like all this other kind of stuff. I list out the things we have to do that day, and she can pick what order they're in unless it's something like you have to do this before this, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So like she has some like autonomy there where she can pick what we're doing. She has a scheduled break time. She can pick where she wants that break. Does she want it first thing? Does she want it at the end? Does she want it right smack dab in the middle? So I give her all these choices, and she still won't do anything for me. And so I don't really know, like the only thing I could think of that's triggering her is my presence.
Okay. What is
So I
it
don't
about
know.
you that you think might trigger that?
That I take her from class maybe?
Okay. Why would that be a problem for her?
Because I only take 3 other kids in the school. I don't
Okay.
know. And so maybe she feels different. But she has some days where she's like, oh good, I don't want to be in PE today. And then other days where
Okay.
she hates that I take her.
Yeah,
So
I mean, and how many of us have students who kind of like, we become the flag of their differences. We are pointing out all of their differences, how they differ from their peers. And 6th grade, there's probably nothing more important than peers, right? And so all of a sudden now, you're going to make me stand out. I already stand out. I want to do is whatever I can to not stand out, at least not stand out in a way that's I don't deem as necessarily favorable, right? Kind of a situation. So yeah, you guys are going to have a rough road to hoe on that one, right? Okay. So anything you could think of that would increase, what kind of things might increase, options might increase her desire to want to be doing something with you?
So last year, what was effective sometimes is when I would get other students and they would come with her during certain sessions. But like I said, the school is very strict on when I'm allowed to pull kids, and there's no one else on her team. So no one else is in PE or lunch or RTI during the same time that she is, so I can't pull another student when I pull her, unless I pull like someone from the general PE class, and the PE teacher tries to avoid that because they have like standards and everything they have to meet and all that also. And I actually haven't approached the school and be like, hey, can I pull a random kid that I don't know to have come and sit with her or anything like that. But like in the past that had worked, it's just that no longer that is not an option based on what the school allows me to do with my students.
Okay. All right. You have a suggestion? Hang on a minute. Wait till we get the speaker thing or the microphone.
Thank you. Can she come to you instead of you going and getting her?
We tried that, and she wanders the halls for 10 minutes and doesn't actually come to me. So I can't trust her to come to me on her own.
Can you meet her like at the hallway right outside so she can't wander? Like you'll be there?
Like I stand outside of the gym because I get her from PE. I do not go in the gym. So she sees me, and then I just wait out there, and she'll come to me when she's done, and then we walk down the hall. But I don't, like, I can't wait by my room because she will not come to my room. She wanders.
Okay. So it sounds, at least from what you're talking about, that you may have a pretty good idea that this has got something to do with peers and her sense of position with peers in terms of being there. If she's willing to come with peers, not willing to come if you don't have it, you're pulling her out something special. So, all right. So, I mean, I think this becomes one of those challenges that we have in programs like this, is that schools oftentimes, we were talking at lunchtime, schools oftentimes make decisions that's best for schools and not necessarily best for kids. And sometimes it really just takes somebody sitting down and talking just very openly and very seriously about what is this particular child's needs that maybe can break a little of the ice in a situation like that. But
Just talking about that, like trying to break the ice with the school. I know you said the RTI is a time that you pull her, that maybe another kid that's on RTI that needs pulled, if you say, hey, I could help this kid too, and then they see you as like an ally, and then maybe that'll open some other doors.
Yeah, maybe I honestly haven't tried to pull a kid that's not one of my deaf and hard of hearing students. Like I've never tried to pull someone that's like gen ed or is receiving the RTI services. I've only ever pulled with other students who have a
Right.
hearing loss to kind of give her that like, oh, I'm not the only one. There's camaraderie here. And one of the kids moved and the other one is switched to a 504. So she might also be a little salty about that
Yeah.
he's not seeing me regularly and she still is.
Yeah.
Because she asked me, when am I done seeing you?
when am I what?
When am I done seeing you?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, you're kind of a big old label of, I've got a problem, right? Kind of a situation. You're making me special, okay.
Do you have other kids on your caseload from other buildings that are like close in age to her or that might have similar interests? You could maybe like make videos for each other. They could be like video pen pals, even if they can't be pulled together, maybe she could still develop a relationship with another student on your caseload or another itinerant in your network?
I have a couple of kids, but sorry.
Oh, sorry. Your turn.
I have a couple of kids that are around the same age, but I have none that have her needs. She used to be in a deaf and hard of hearing program, and the district insisted on pulling her back, which I thought was a mistake, but we don't have our own, and so it was outplaced, and they were trying to pull her back, and so I feel like there was also that social piece. She's my only student that uses sign language. She will not use it consistently. She gets mad at me if I sign in front of like other people and everything. So there's just a lot of things working against her, and a lot of it is things that I don't have control over. And so I do have a few other kids, but not ones that are like at her level of like need. And so I don't know if they would just make her feel more different, because they're almost more typical, like they're more like towards like typically developing than having like a hearing loss, because like they have unilateral hearing loss, no hearing aid, things like that, and she has bilateral hearing loss, uses total communication, and I just feel like it would almost accentuate her differences.
One thing that we've had some success with in terms of students that is doing like bibliotherapy, and you might work with a general ed teacher, you might do it as part of it, but where they can be teaching language arts. So I can be teaching things like plot, character, setting, all that kind of stuff. But the book that I'm using it with is somebody who's overcoming an issue. So it doesn't have to be deafness, it could be any issue, but how it makes them feel different, all those, and we're going to talk about all those dynamics in around that character. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with this character. That's all we're talking about, is what's going on, and how that must feel, and what that issue is, and how fighting that, then they're giving something up. But by not, and so what's the give and take of being part of that? Then incidentally, you can start doing things where you're going, you're just like Randy in the book. I know this has got to be tough for you. And so in some cases, helping students put words to some of those feelings, and it's always a question. I'm not necessarily saying this is you, but could this be? Could you be feeling some of those same kinds of things? It seems like you are. And you always give them the opportunity to say, screw you, I'm not feeling that way at all. Okay, well, that's why I'm asking, kind of a thing. But it sounds like she's struggling. So it's how do we set that up? Okay. Anybody else real quick, and then we'll move on. Okay, we'll just move on. All right, so what happened here? No signal. Okay, a couple of things. We talked about IEP forms or BIP forms, those kind of things. This is one of those areas where some people go, where do you put some of this stuff? And on whatever form you have, and I know the state's got some, it's crazy. Every school tends to have different things. Indiana just now tried to make a uniform one, but they've got some problems. But somewhere in your behavior intervention form, your FBA form, there should be some section that talks about describing environmental conditions that may affect the behavior. And this usually includes things like medication, medical conditions, lack of sleep, diet, temperature. This is where if I've got a diagnosed mental health issue, this is where you would want to put that in there. Now, people will talk about the fact that you've got all that HIPAA stuff and all these issues, and can you put these things in? People have the right to know that have the right to know. If I'm reading this kid's BIP, I generally should have the right to know, because it's going to affect what's going on. All right? But you may have to play that game a little bit in terms of, and helping parents understand what's going on. This is also where I make sure if the student is on medications, and the parents share the medications with me, and I try to encourage them to do that, because I cannot control what I don't know. But there are a lot of medications and I usually will then list each medication and go under the section and go on Medline or whatever and capture the two little front paragraphs about this medication. What is it for? And what are the side effects that I should be careful about? One of the issues here is that, again, when we're talking about kids who have some significant behavior issues, not everyone, but almost any mood elevating medication impacts the body's ability to dissipate heat. So for example, if I'm on risperidol, I dissipate heat 6 times less efficiently than if I don't have it. If you restrain me, the likelihood that I might die of overheating is significantly greater. Right? So I need to know that as a staff member, that this is a medication I should be concerned about. The PE teacher and the coaches should also know this. because they could be putting this child in life-threatening situations when all of a sudden as a discipline they have them run in bleachers or some kind of a situation. And so this is really critical information that should be put in should be find a place in the FBA if you possibly can have it. The other thing, we'll go zip on the way down here. You guys remember this from our sessions before? Amen. So you got the behavior. Yeah, we'll pretend. When I talk about a couple of things, so here's the target behavior. Here's the desired behavior. Are there things I need to do to promote this student being successful? This might be where I talk about this kid needs some cognitive behavioral interventions dealing around anger. This child needs some cognitive behavioral interventions dealing around trauma. Do I have that labeled and put in there? Are there things on the prevention side? This is a child with oppositional defiant disorder. If you are going to correct this student, we're not giving him a free pass on things that he does wrong, but you had better not come in with a harsh, stern voice. You need to be businesslike and calm and caring. We're still going to draw the line, but if I come into this kid with my guns blaring, I'm gonna get an explosion. All right? Do I have that documented in terms of what are we doing to promote success? What are we doing to prevent failure? Then when it comes down to, all right, the student does what you want them to do, yes. What should I do? No. That's where you might actually list some examples. So if there are some things that, some of the triggers are math, some of the triggers are such and such, here are some options that you could have kind of easily available that this student would be likely to collect and work on. Have them labeled there. And I tend to try to have, this kind of, again, I hope people remember this if you were in that session, like a flow chart in terms of what's going on, because especially for those students that are in general education classrooms, so I'm a typical general education teacher, let's say at the middle school or high school level, I might have 60 kids that come through my classes in the course of the day that have an IEP. What's the likelihood I'm going to have read 60 IEPs? And of those 60, maybe 35 have a BIP. Will I know it? All right, so if I can get this on a one-page flow sheet, here's the behavior, here's what we're doing, boom, at least I've got a prayer. This is fifth hour. Here are the 3 kids in my fifth hour class that have a behavior plan, and here it is sketched out. All right, and if you can't get it that clear, you probably need to do more work on it. All right, if I really want it to be, and mental health issues are kind of the new crisis that we're going to face as schools. The feds truly want the school to be the site for children's mental health. Guidelines around restraint and seclusion, a number of things that are coming down the pike are going to make schools a lot more responsible for their reaction and dealings with kids with mental health problems. So the clearer we can be on some of this stuff, the better we're going to be. All right? Let me get back to...
Are they going to provide training?
No. That'll be the school's responsibility.
Oh.
Are they going to...
Are they going to provide training?
And I mean, I'll tell you right now, this is one of the hot areas. If your school is a school that has a grant writer or has somebody that can write grants, they are desperately looking for model programs in terms of how do you deliver children's mental health services in the school setting. And so schools that want to put together a plan and have a situation, this is easy money to get right now, to actually model and put, the Centers for Disease Control, Office of Special Education, Institutes for Mental Health, all of them are big-time funding sources right now for this kind of a thing for a school district. Because they realize that that's probably going to be where if we're going to be successful, it's going to happen. Okay? All right, so we've talked about that. Keeping your teachers from engaging in that power struggle, all right, that curriculum of control. When you're working with teachers, and many of you are in collaborative kinds of situations where you're in consulting and collaborating, we oftentimes don't like conflict. And so we'll see teachers do things that really aren't helping, but we don't know how to talk to them about it. We've got to get better at that. And quite frankly, again, you're not going to get much behavior change on a kid's part unless you get change on a teacher's part. So being able to identify what the teacher's doing and talking very openly about that, we're not blaming people. I mean, everybody does the best job they can, but this isn't working. And being able to talk about it openly is going to be critical, and tying that up in that behavior plan. This is just some data that we did for 3 little guys. And what we basically did was just that two choices, empathetic I statement, 2 choices, and a teacher using a self-control plan. And first one was with a kid who was doing withdrawal and elopement. One was destruction and aggression. The other one was just aggression. But what you can see is that, I mean, not that we are eliminating the problems, but we saw a pretty significant drop in some of the behaviors. This is one where it was going down, and then it went back up, and what we found was the teacher wasn't using their self-control plan anymore. And all of a sudden, they were screaming and hollering, and we had to retrain the self-control plan, and then we got the behavior to drop down some. But I mean, here's aggression. We got it down to pretty much 0. And this was a kid who literally, when he became aggressive, tore up the classroom. I mean, you were moving everybody out of the room. He was tearing up the room.
Question?
Yep.
Rick, I just have a question. You keep saying self-control plan for teachers. Do you have examples or slides or ideas as to what this looks like? Should we want to bring this back to the staff and talk about helping staff develop their own self-control plans?
Yep, hang on just a minute. Nope, I guess I thought I had a slide there, but I don't. Generally, it usually includes at least 2, if not 3 components. There's usually some self-talk. So it's a message. I can get through this. I'm all right. Remember that you've got seconds. This is not like I'm going to go through the Serenity Prayer. I've got a few seconds. So like mine again is one more day. I take a deep breath. Some people may take a couple of deep breaths, and I touch my fingers together. I have one person that takes one little step back. All right. It's kind of each person. It really, a lot of it doesn't matter totally what it is. It's just you get yourself ready to do that. It's that cognition that I'm going to potentially lose control here or move away from control. I'm going to take a deep breath. I realize that my body's going into fight or flight. So one of the things I want to do is I want to kind of oxygenate the blood that I have. I'm going to take that deep breath. I'm going to collect some thoughts here in terms of some self-talk. I'm going to try to keep myself in space and realize I may have to redo that 4, 5, 6 times during this crisis situation. But I'm responsible for my behavior. That's the only behavior I can control. And so we actually tell teachers now, I want to hear what your self-control plan is. Not just, I'm going to have one. No, you tell me what it is. You have to tell me what it is so I know you've developed one. All right? And move them through. Yes?
Hi, a lot of what you are suggesting is say it again? Oh, sorry. A lot of what you're saying is part of something that we use as CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute, and yes, it's a restraint thing, but the focus is on de-escalation techniques,
right,
and how you approach child and the power struggle, don't pick up the rope, that kind of thing.
Right.
But that's drilled into the staff constantly during that whole training.
Yeah. And we were talking at sometime, lunch, I don't know, one of the breaks. There's about 24 different crisis prevention programs in the country. And there's an interesting article in Education and Treatment of Children. It was written by Mike Cavillion, Reese Peterson, Joe Ryan, and I can't remember who the fourth author is. But they took all of the intervention programs and they basically asked each one, here are categories. So de-escalation, how many restraint techniques do you teach, all this. And each organization responded to that. This is what percentage of our time is dealing with de-escalation. This is what percentage of our time deals with what do the staff bring to the table. This is what portion of our program. And it just basically lays it all out. And if you are, especially if restraint and seclusion is a big issue in your school, or you want to deal with it, or the philosophy, it is a great article to get. It's completely independent. It wasn't done by any of these organizations. But it talks about what's going on. And so things like, how much time do if your people say I'm going to restraint training, you've got a problem with your philosophy. Because they shouldn't be going to restraint training, they should be going to de-escalation training. This is, we never want to get to restraint. All right? But I don't know how many places go, I'm going to go learn how to restrain. And if that's what they see, that's what they're going to do. All right? If that's my mindset, all right? But it talks about those kinds of things in terms of, it also talks about, for example, the smallest number of restraint holds that any of these teach, I think, is 4. One teaches 26. Now, all of them do it in the same amount of time. If I'm teaching 4, let's say in a half a day to my staff, when I actually train it to them, that gives me a couple, maybe an hour on each one. If I'm teaching 27 in a half a day, I've got about 5 minutes, right? 10 minutes. How many do it make sense? So as a school, you need to be making clear, cognizant decisions based on who we are, what's going on. This is a hot area. Right now, there are hearings going on right now in Washington, D.C. They want to take seclusion completely off the table for schools. Right? Ultimately, I think it'll happen. Right? Restraint, they're struggling more with, but clearly it's going to be dealt with. Right? One of the other things that's coming down the pike where behavior becomes important is that we have been suspending kids kind of willy-nilly. Right? You wear the wrong clothes, you're suspended for a day. You tell me to do something that's physiologically impossible, you're suspended for a day. Does that remove a child from school? Is it my legal right to be at school? Did you do any due process before you suspended me? You are denying my rights without due process. That is constitutionally something you can't do. States have just kind of turned a blind eye. They've told schools, you have the right to set these systems up. Thank you. Don't tell us what your system is. All right? And schools have just been able to kind of do the suspension stuff. We're getting parents now suing schools for suspending their child without due process. And what we're seeing, 13 states now have changed their rules and regulations around suspension and suspension. For example, if you are in California, if you suspend me for a day, when I come back, I've got a BIP. You're doing an FBA and a BIP on me, because if you're saying you're going to take away my schooling, you better have a plan. That's every kid who gets suspended. Okay, so we're going to start seeing some huge issues, and Illinois is the most litigious state in this country. So the odds are we're going to see some stuff coming down the pike probably pretty quick. And unfortunately, as teachers, as schools, we tend not to deal with these issues until somebody makes us. And then we bitch, right? Damn school people, damn lawyers, what are they doing, I think we have to start looking ahead of time and say, look, at restraint, seclusion, and suspension are going to start being incredibly micromanaged. We better be looking very seriously at how we use them and start policing ourselves. Right? This especially becomes a problem when the kid has a mental health issue. One of the big areas is all of a sudden I'm being suspended for what is a part of my mental health issue. Now you're in real trouble. Okay, so we get double whammied on this kind of thing. All right. All right. We need to know medications. We need to know what's going on. We need to know the age. I'm in a due process. Actually, tomorrow I'm testifying in a due process in Indiana. One of the problems that they're going to face is that they've got a kid on one of the medications they've got a student on is on the student is 6. The medication isn't approved for anybody under the age of 13. Okay. And so it's going to be that's going to come out of the whole issue. But do I know the medications? Do I know what's going on? For example, depression, there are only 2 medications currently approved for kids.
Are those the medications the child is on?
No, these are just some that I just threw up there that are pretty common.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah.
Making sure.
Yeah. She was asking if those were the medications the student was on. No, these are just ones that I put up there because anxiety and depression are ones that you don't oftentimes see. We don't always necessarily know what's going on, and we see what's happening in terms of, but we should know those medications. You should know what's happening. And again, be sure to list them. Be sure to talk about side effects. Right? If this makes the kid tired, if this makes the kid thirsty, all right, so that if all of a sudden the kid's putting his head down, realize this is probably a medication issue, and it may be an over-medication issue. Right? Okay. All right, interesting. The arrows are not showing up there.
They're there. They're just very faint.
Yeah, they're really dark on them when I really did it. Like, talk to me. Okay. Basically, one of the issues, and we talked a little bit about this before, we're talking about cognitive behavioral interventions, far more powerful when you're dealing with mental health issues because it puts that thoughts issue. So what you've got is basically the trigger, an arrow that goes to thoughts, all right? Then those thoughts go to emotion, they go to behavior, that goes to consequence, the emotion goes to consequence, consequence goes back to thoughts. So it's kind of refeeding itself in terms of what's going on, and I have to get at the thoughts. That means somebody has to actually be spending some time processing these issues with me and talking about what's going on. So many of these situations, we'll talk about programs for kids like this and with mental health issues. In some cases, we're looking at perhaps as much as 20 to 30% of their day is looking at social emotional aspects and not just the academics. So now that doesn't mean you can't double dip. So we might be doing things like in terms of social, the social networking. We've got kids where reading is a problem. We'll do things like repeated reading, where all of a sudden now I'm going to have a passage at this kid's acquisition level. The passage may deal with something about how to solve a social problem. It may be on how to meet a friend. It can be just an interest thing. It's got something to do with Star Wars, whatever it is. But it's at his acquisition level. He or she now goes out and finds 10 people in the school to read this to. Each person signs the back of the paper that's been read to them. We oftentimes, if it's oral reading kind of a thing, we'll actually tape record a situation. If it's a quiz, just in terms of where there's not oral reading, but there's a comprehension thing, we'll look at the first time they read it and the 10th time and show them how much growth they've done in their reading, and their fluency and their comprehension and all those different kinds of things around what's going on. And it can be really powerful, but they've also met 10 different people. They've also had 10 opportunities to socially connect in terms of what's going on, to be acknowledged, to be praised around what's going on. So we try to find ways to double dip on some of those things. Okay. We have to teach kids to self-regulate. We're not trying to do it to where we're doing all the work. We want them to do the work, which means we really have to teach them to self-monitor. So check in and check out, we've talked about that before every time I've come. It's one of the most powerful behavioral tools we have. We always look at an empirically validated intervention by its effect size when you do a meta-analysis of that particular intervention. If an intervention has an effect size of 0.7, that means it's moved the population 0.7%, 70% of a standard deviation, it's considered effective. Check in and check out, when done correctly, has an effect size of 1.8. It is the most powerful tool we have. It's almost never done right. Okay? It should be targeting the desired behavior. So here are the 3 desired behaviors I want. This kid should be getting feedback. Did you show those? And if I showed it at my average level or above, I get full points, whatever the point system is. All right? It's not like, well, you're doing 40% compliance. When you do 90, it means you're going to... And so the rest of weeks, I'm going, no. And by about the second or third day, I'm doing it. The kid's going, no. Right? So I've got to catch it where the kid is at and say, yes, you're doing great. And that number moves. That means it's a little work for us because we've got to keep that average moving. Right? This is not a report card to say he was a jerk again today. This is positive. This is... What makes this powerful is that done right, it forces teachers to acknowledge what the kid is doing well, because we don't do that naturally. Even teachers, when we praise academics. We rarely praise behavior. This forces the teacher to give positive comments about the behavior. All right? Incredibly powerful. Okay? We, at some point, want kids self-monitoring themselves. You write what you think you did. All right? Put it in pencil. Then we'll talk and we'll put it in ink. All right? But I want you to start judging yourself. And quite frankly, to begin with, self-monitoring in and of itself generally will improve behavior, even if it's not accurate. Just the fact that the kid is keeping track of it will generally have some impact on improving the behavior. We then want them to evaluate. How do you think you did? All right? You monitored yourself good. Was today a good day? What do you think? Did you do your best? Where were you having the best luck? Where did you struggle? What do you think led to that struggle? Right? And then can we get them to start thinking about self-rewarding?
What do you do with about 1/3 of those kids who have no idea?
That's part of what and in some cases, I'll see programs that will like mark it at the end of the period, right? Or in some cases, I've got one I'm fighting with right now that does it at the end of the day. All right? Now, Remember Bazooka Joe? Remember Bubblegum, Bazooka Bubblegum? There was a comic, they used to have comics. There was a comic one time, and it was Bazooka Joe was looking for something, and somebody came and said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I lost my car keys. I'm looking for my car keys." He said, "Where'd you lose them?" He said, "Well, I lost them about 2 blocks that way." He said, "Well, what are you doing looking here for? The light's better." There are times where I'll see what the teachers are doing, and it's like, "Why are you doing it this way?" "Well, I can do it this way." It's like, "Yeah, but this doesn't do any good." I've got to have the interval that I'm giving feedback has got to be small enough that the kid can keep in his mind how he's behaved. For some kids, that means I'm doing almost an ongoing. For a lot of young kids, I've got situations where anytime I'm walking by, you're in your seat. All right, that's one of your behaviors. I'm giving you a check. All right, you're being safe. You're doing your work. And I teach everybody that comes into the room, anytime you walk by and he's doing one of these behaviors, give him a check. And that's not data. Because quite frankly, on a bad day, he may have more checks than a good day. Because anytime her butt's in the chair, I want to make sure somebody's noticing it, because her butt's not in the chair very often today. All right? That's a process document. All right? That's what gets her butt in the chair. But I've got to keep it, and then pretty soon I start saying, you keep track. I've had situations where I've got random tapes that have music, or have sounds, or a light that'll flash that will say, when that flashes, you mark down what you think you did on these behaviors. And it doesn't matter if it's accurate to begin with. Now, oftentimes I will then start looking in terms of, I want to see if it's accurate, and if it's accurate, it means even more. Right? If we agree, you get 2 points. If we don't agree, you get 1 point, or whatever the situation is. But you've got to start teaching that. That's something you have to teach kids. We're seeing a lot more work with schools allowing things for stress management. Movement kind of breaks, and yoga and brain activities. And the research is not real clear on a lot of this. It's just kind of building some of the mindfulness stuff and all this. But we've got a lot of anecdotal support so far, and we're starting to see some empirical support for some of these things. But we know that there are biorhythms and all this kind of stuff. Some of it, during the time of this presentation, each and every one of you has come in and out of this presentation mentally. Right? You're on top of it, you're listening to what's going on, and then pretty soon you're thinking, shit, on the way home I got to pick up the dry cleaning, and all of a sudden you're gone, right? And then a little bit later you're back in again. And that's just normal. We all do that all day long. Okay? Some of these movement breaks actually allow you to kind of reset the stage. Okay? Now we get everybody back on, and we've got a period again where everybody's ready to learn. Problem solving, it's amazing how many of our kids cannot even identify what the problem is. And again, I use a lot of bibliotherapy kinds of things for some of that in terms of can we identify the problem in the story. Because sometimes it's easier for them to do it outside of themselves because they don't have to own anything. Right? I'm not taking any responsibility for it, so I'm just talking. And then we move it in to themselves. But we start the process, can I identify the problem? What could be options with that problem? Can I start to begin to think about, well, what would be the consequence if I took this option? So I'm on the playground, I'm walking towards the swing. She runs over and grabs this, she looks right at me, and then she runs over and she sits on the swing. She knew I was coming to that swing. What could I do? I could go push her butt off that swing, because it's my swing, right? I could tell her that I was going to the swing, I'm sorry that you took it, I think that was not very nice. I could realize that she has a chance to get the swing too and ignore what's going on. I could do a number of things. What would be the potential consequences on each of those? You're waiting to see if she's going to say something? Some means ends thinking kind of a situation. Can I begin to we are doing things in some schools where we're doing stuff like, for example, there's programs like Peace Path. I don't know if people are familiar with that. And Peace Path is basically, it's a little problem-solving strategy in which you basically have her footprints. And some schools are painting them on their playground, some schools have them in their classroom. So let's say that same situation. All of a sudden, I'm upset, maybe we got in an argument, we're squawking back and forth at each other. Somebody may come, you guys need to go to Peace Path. So we would stand there and we would sit there and I would go, what's your first name? Peggy, I was going towards the swing set. I know you saw me go to the swing set. And you ran right over and you took the swing knowing full well I was going to take it. I wanted it. Okay. So now Peggy's job is to tell me what she heard me say. Okay. Then we move to the next step and Peggy says, you're right, I saw you going towards the swing, Rick. And you know what? You're a swing pig. You take the swing every day, right? And you never let anybody else have the swing. And so, yes, I saw you going, and I didn't think it was fair, and so I took the swing. And I tell her what I heard her say, and we step to the next thing, and we talk about how we're feeling, and we come up with a solution, and we agree, and we move on. And we do that every time there's a problem. Right? They have, some schools have, like the little old patrol people, like little belts kind of a thing, or little vest. This is my day, I'm third grader, I'm out on the playground looking for kids with problems, right? So I can go, you guys need to go to Peace Path, and I can bring them over and we can walk through Peace Path. And we'll have parents call and say, what's this Peace Path? We're going, why? Well, last night my husband and I were having a discussion, and our son said, Mom, you guys need to go to Peace Path. So, but do we have ways to begin helping kids figure out those how to use these skills on an ongoing basis? We have a lot of kids, especially as you're starting into middle school and high school, where they have already got into some attributional kind of, there is no reason for me to study. This is all just luck. I'm stupid, there's nothing I can do about it. And what they're telling themselves, those beliefs, those attributes that they're, dictate how they respond. And so you begin to have to actually challenge those. And again, it's not going to happen just in a quick discussion. So that's where sometimes these kids really need some pretty extensive social emotional programming. So you're looking at the event, what am I attributing it to? What do I expect? How does that make me feel? And then what do I do with behavior? And you actually start to begin to challenge them. We know that most kids do not get mental health services. Okay? So 70% of the kids out there, there's kind of the 70% just keeps showing up. About 70% of kids get no mental health supports. This is especially true if I'm a minority student. Okay? And of those that get it, 70% get it at the school. Okay? Now, 75%, okay? All right. Why the school? A lot of schools don't have any mental health services, and they simply refer. Here's the good mental health program, here's some good therapists. I think your little Billy would be helpful if they went and saw that. Here's the name and number. There's a 17% chance any parent will follow up on that. If the services are delivered at the school, either by school personnel or by a cooperative agreement where the services are delivered at the school, the chances of a kid getting those services is 98%. That is exactly why the feds want the schools to become the basis for children's mental health. Okay? It takes care of sometimes stigma, ability to get the kids there, all kinds of stuff. It makes a huge difference. Okay? School districts use different systems to do this. Some schools do it themselves. They have their own social workers, psychologists, counselors. They may even have a mental health person that they pay off their payroll. Some schools have a contract. Some schools do some combination of both of those. Some schools do, we've got a few people on school, but we basically just refer outside. And basically the breakdown is, again, these are not showing up. The colors aren't showing up. I don't know why. I can get my glasses on. I'll tell you what these really are because I'm, okay. Okay, 33% of schools do it exclusively, 25% outside school referrals, 17% mutual agreement contract, and 25% there was no specific plan. That was at least in the, I think those statistics are from like 2012, so I think that was the last time anything was done on that. So we've got different issues, all right. Where this is funded by, a lot of them are using special education funds to pay for mental health services. 49% use local funds that they get available through local grants, foundations, those kinds of things. 41% use state general funds, and 38% use Medicaid reimbursement to pay for these services. Okay. One of the issues that we've been terribly successful with doing, that I strongly urge people to do, is connect with your local mental health and mental health providers. For example, we've had a number of school districts where the superintendent has gone to United Way and say, look, schools don't fail communities till communities fail schools. You've got agencies that do children's services looking for money that serve kids. We got kids. Could you add one more question to your package that agencies have to fill out when they're going to ask for United Way monies? How do you work with your local public school? Now, if I'm Catholic Social Services, if I'm Lutheran Social Services, if I am the Tinley Park Youth Service Bureau, and I want money for children's services, I've got to have a response to how I work with my local public school, or I'm not getting that United Way money. So now they're coming to the schools and going, what can we do to help you? So instead of begging them to use their limited resources to serve your population, you become a key feature of their getting money to serve their population. And it changes the dynamics tremendously. We have not had a single United Way refuse to do it. Okay, they see the logic of this kind of a situation. Now, that doesn't make it necessarily a walk in the park. You've still got to find space for them to provide services. There's still some coordination aspects to it. There's still a bit of logistics to make this kind of thing work. But all of a sudden, you've got horses to pull the wagon. We've got schools that, for example, if I am going to an in-school suspension for fighting, usually what happens when I go to in-school suspension in most schools? When I go down there, what's going to happen? Who am I going to be there with? All the other kids. What are you in for? Yeah, she is a bitch, right? And it's just old home week, right? And what do I do while I'm there? I sit in a study carrel with a bunch of books that I don't even look at. We've got schools like that will go, okay, if you're sent down for fighting, the first 2 hours is going to be the first of a 15-session anger management program that's being run by Catholic Social Services. Okay? And they link that stuff right into what's going on and start having instructional consequences for behavior. If our students' wounds were visible, okay, if our mental health wounds were visible, how you treat that kid is very different than how you would treat this kid. Okay? But we've got many kids who are coming with look just like that emotionally. All right? But they're invisible wounds. And what we have to help teachers and staff and everybody realize is that these are real. We as Americans do not like mental health issues. We don't want to have to admit dealing with it. We still have a lot of stigma to it. I keep thinking back to the day when Eagleton was running for vice president. We found out that he'd seen a psychiatrist and he had to withdraw because, God, you couldn't have a vice president that ever had a mental health issue.
We got one.
No, we don't. We have a president that has a mental health issue. Okay. And the Trump supporters are going, I'm going to let the air out of your tires. Okay. All right. The other thing that we've got to keep in mind is that not all interventions help. Okay? And as people in schools, we have to realize that sometimes what we're doing hurts. So for example, if I am in middle school or high school and I've got an anger management group, and I bring together 8 angry kids because we're going to work with your anger, the research is blatantly clear that when they leave, they will be angrier. Okay? They will support each other's normative beliefs that, damn right, smack them hard, right? And this stupid adult that keeps telling us this is wrong is clearly out of, they don't know where the hell they're coming from. But the 8 of us all know that if somebody gets in your face, you go for them. All right? And they will leave that group even angrier than they came in. You need to know the research of the interventions you're doing. That's an easy way to give services, and I'll go into I don't know how many schools, and it'll be like, we've got an anger group, and it's go, yeah, you're making things worse, right? We do the same thing with some of our in-school suspensions, and so we're doing the very same thing. We are concentrating normative beliefs that support one another because it's convenient, right? Makes no sense. Suspension. And one of the other reasons that this is we're being challenged with this is that there is absolutely, for multiple suspensions, there is some empirical support for a single suspension. And that's for the kid who, once they get suspended, will never ever do it again. And the reality is they probably didn't need the suspension. If you'd probably just talked to them, they wouldn't have done it again either, okay? But for a one-time suspension, you've got a mild bit of support that you can actually reduce the behavior. There is absolutely no empirical support for multiple suspensions. The only thing it correlates with is school failure, more suspensions, dropout, and going to prison and the prison pipeline. That is the only correlations. We have no way to defend it. Okay? So I think one of the issues becomes one of saying, what are we doing? How are we thinking about these kinds of things? There are some school-based programs. There's an interesting book written or edited by Matthew Mayer, Rick Van Acker, John Lockman, and Frank Gresham. It talks about school-based cognitive behavioral interventions for kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. So it's a little different population than you're working with, but it talks about various kinds of issues, whether it's anger and anxiety and depression, and talks about the various interventions that you can do. But there are some good ones out here. For anger, the anger coping program, school-based intervention. Okay, so these are packaged programs that people can, usually they're somewhere between 8 and 15 sessions. They're relatively time limited. They're usually like somewhere between 35 and 50 minutes for a session. But these have all been empirically supported in terms of being effective. So this one happens to be, again, groups of 4 to 6 students. You've got 2 co-leaders. All right, but it looks at specifically at anger. This is John Lockman, again, looking at anger, cognitive behavioral intervention. They've got 2 issues here. You've got one for 8 to 12-year-olds, and he's actually got a session now for older kids. But again, it's looking at some empirically validated interventions programs. Coping Cat. This is kind of a fun one. For the little guys, it's actually got some puppet kind of stuff that you can work with. And there are different systems that you have, but again, it's allowing you to begin to work systematically with these issues. If you've got whether it's in the classroom, social worker, whatever kind of situation. And they do have, the CAT project is basically taking coping cats for older kids. Now you're doing it for adolescents. Think Good, Feel Good. This is looking at a number of issues around, it's got a lot of different things for depression and anxiety. And this is one that actually has a couple of things going for it. It's got some actual multiple session formats to lay out, and it's got some standalone activities that you can do. So this can be put into place even as kind of just, I don't have a kid maybe who has a real significant issue with anxiety, but I know anxiety is a problem in general I want to address. I can bring in these standalone pieces. Taking action for depressed youth, again, 9 to 13-year-old. This is not for bipolar, this is for unipolar depression kind of situations, but again, it's a program that's already been shown to be effective. It's school-based. Bright Futures is just kind of what do we know empirically to work with, and this is any number of issues, not just mental health kinds of issues. This looks at a lot of behavioral issues. It looks at a lot of even academic, learned helplessness kind of issues, some of those kinds of things, and talk about strategies, evidence-driven systems that can be used looking at health and well-being of all children. And strategies that work for primary care. This looks more at how do I begin to change the philosophy of my school? How do I begin to link into families? How do I link into communities? How do I get some of those resources and make them available to me? It's not a bad resource. And you can actually download that one. Okay. And this is, I know that people have seen this before. I love this quote. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. My personal approach creates the climate. My daily mood makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal, In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. I believe that with every fiber of my being. I think as teachers, we have one of the most powerful jobs in the world. We make a tremendous impact. I think of we were doing a grant, developing a program for antisocial behavior. And we started off, we were working with schools in Aurora, Illinois and Chicago, Illinois. And we had 225 schools. And so we were meeting with the teachers and we said, okay, what we'd like you to do is to write a half a page about the teacher that had the greatest impact in your life. And what we thought was that these are people who chose to be educators, that they would be telling us about these wonderful teachers that did something wonderful. Almost half of the messages that we got, half patients, was a teacher who did something kind of dreadful. It was Mrs. Smith who told me to lip sync during the recital in 3rd grade that stole my love of music. And we're thinking, holy shit, this is the teachers. What if we'd asked a group of plumbers, right? And and you're thinking that, it's like, clearly this 3rd grade teacher was probably doing this recital and this kid couldn't carry a tune in a bucket and going, God, could you just not sing? It'll sound so much better. Clearly not thinking that 20 years later when somebody said, who had the greatest impact on you, it was going to be this stupid offhanded comment that she made. But it was. Right? We have to realize we are incredibly powerful. And again, we can humor, we can humiliate, we can torture, or we can make things pretty delightful. Right? Okay. Highly effective teachers are intentional about their teaching. Good teachers are clear about what they're trying to teach, and they master the broad repertoire of instructional strategies to help students accomplish their learning goals. They know not only what to do to support student learning, but how, when, and why to do it. Right? So again, being purposeful, and I like to end on a cartoon. And it's When Pigs Fly, right? Okay. And I like that. You just don't see that kind of can-do attitude every day. All right? We're asking you guys to go out and do the impossible with a very challenging population of students. Thank you for doing it. Not a lot of people want to be where you're at, but thank you for doing it. All right, questions? Comments? You've got a whole 12 minutes. Everybody's going, if anybody raises their hand, I'll rip your arm off and beat you with it.
We'll do the functional analysis later.
In the morning session, you were talking about going to school to see about an inclusion and how the impact of inclusion or whatever. In the morning session, you talked about going and doing a study of how inclusion was working in a school. What was the outcome of that? Because you segued into behavior of all things.
What we found was that students generally found their way into a social network, but it was usually the least favorable social network. So they would find themselves into groups that were probably more permeable and more willing to take on new members, in some cases because they could be victimized by that group. So it was not hearts and flowers. On the other hand, they were finding a way in. What I would like to have done, we didn't do it because we didn't have the access, but I would like to have done a follow-up, because this was a relatively new process for this school to be doing a lot of the inclusion. I would like to have seen 3 years later, were they still in those same groups, or had they found ways and developed skills to allow them to move to other groups. But what we found was that they were generally going into the groups of more troublesome kind of kids and more, unfortunately. Okay. Questions, comments? You've been wonderful. Thank you very much.